Hey guys, tonight we're heading back to Victorian England, the age of corsets, canes and crushing emotional repression. Specifically, we're diving into the absolute mess that was dating during this period. And heads up, you probably won't survive this. Emotionally, maybe not physically either, depending on your social class and whether or not you dare to show an ankle in public. Things were that strict. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not here for fake love. That's what Victorian marriage was for. Oh, and tell me, what city are you listening from and what time is it right now? I love seeing how far and wide our little sleep-deprived history gang reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're born into a world where everything is already decided for you. The moment you pop out of the womb, swaddled in lace or linen depending on how much your parents earn, or don't, your romantic future is more or less predetermined. If you're upper class, your path is marriage for money. If you're middle class, it's marriage for social advancement. And if you're working class, well, good luck finding time to fall in love between shifts at the textile mill. Love, as a concept, is not completely foreign to you, but it's kind of like a luxury perfume. Everyone talks about it. A few people even get to wear it, but for most folks, it's too expensive to risk spilling on your nice clothes. Reputation matters more, property matters way more, and heaven forbid you try to date someone based on feelings. That's the sort of reckless behaviour that gets you cut from the will and sent off to a boarding house for emotionally unstable women. Now don't get it twisted. Victorians love to talk about love. Poems, plays, sweeping novels full of slow burns and stolen glances. But the practice of dating, oh no, dating as we know it, didn't really exist yet. What you have instead is courtship, a rigid, rule-bound process that makes a modern-day job interview seem like a drunken karaoke night. And let's talk about social classes for a minute, because your romantic prospects hinge on where you land in the hierarchy. If you're born into the aristocracy, congratulations, you've basically entered a high-stakes game of human monopoly. Your family is eyeing potential alliances like chess masters. That handsome guy across the ballroom. He's not just a hottie in a waistcoat, he's heir to 3 estates, and your mother will kill you if you mess this up. Meanwhile, if you're middle class, you're probably faking gentility as hard as you can, learning which fork goes where at dinner, and praying your father's business doesn't tank before you secure a marriage that bumps you up a few rungs. Love is optional. Appearances are everything. And if you're working class, well, things are more casual but also harsher. You might have more freedom to fall for someone in your social circle, but marriage still has to be practical. Can they work? Can they cook? Can they survive the next winter without coughing up a lung? The bar isn't high, but the stakes are. So you're growing up, reaching marrying age, probably around 16 to 20 for women, a bit older for men, and the pressure starts closing in like a tightening corset. Your parents begin floating names. Invitations to dinner with suspiciously eligible young people start appearing. Your wardrobe changes. Suddenly your existence is about being visually and morally attractive to the right kind of spouse. But don't get excited. This is not a rom-com montage. This is a slow, subtle siege. You're now a pawn in your family's generational chess match. You don't get to date around. There's no seeing how it goes. There's no coffee. Your first interaction might be across a drawing room. Your second under the watchful eye of both mothers. Your third, maybe, will involve an actual conversation. Alone time? Forget it. You'll be lucky to exchange whispered words in the corner of a crowded parlour. One historical fact for you. Queen Victoria herself, the icon of the age, actually married for love. Prince Albert wasn't just her cousin, gross but common. He was also her intellectual equal, and she genuinely adored him. Their letters are full of passionate devotion and cute little pet names. But this was the royal exception, not the rule. Most Victorian marriages were, frankly, business mergers with a side of mild compatibility. Now here's your quirky side note. Matchmaking wasn't always done by people. Some folks believed in phrenology, the science of reading bumps on your skull to determine character. Want to know if a suitor is trustworthy? Just feel their head. Literally. A lumpy forehead might mean passion. A strong ridge, fidelity. It's pseudoscience meets speed dating, and it was weirdly popular. Of course, there's always debate among scholars about how emotionless Victorian courtship really was. Some argue the elite were more romantic than we give them credit for, just operating within different rules. Others think the whole thing was repressed to the point of dysfunction, resulting in a society full of sexually confused poets and haunted governesses. Honestly, probably both. There's enough historical tea to steep a lifetime's worth of awkward family dinners. Anyway, back to you. You're sitting in your parents' drawing room, sipping weak tea, wearing the one dress that doesn't make your shoulders look too assertive. Across from you, some potential suitor is nervously twisting his gloves, probably rehearsing a compliment about your taste in embroidery or your elegant restraint. You smile politely. Maybe you make a joke, nothing too bold, of course, and the chaperone stifles a cough to remind you that flirting is sin-adjacent. You can already tell this is going to be exhausting. Now that you're officially courtship-aged, and your every breath is being monitored for marital potential, it's time to learn the rules of the game. Because dating in Victorian England, it's not romantic, it's strategic. It's like chess, except instead of kings and queens, you've got baronets and debutantes, and instead of checkmate, you're aiming for a wedding where nobody cries, openly, and at least one family ends up richer than they were last season. You don't just meet someone and see where it goes. That's a recipe for ruin. Everything you do must signal something. You glance at someone too long at a dinner party. That's a public declaration of interest. You don't glance at someone long enough? That's a snub. You accept an invitation to go walking in the garden with someone while Aunt Penelope is not present. That's practically a proposal. The stakes are ridiculous. The tension, constant. You're trapped in a slow-motion dance of social manoeuvring, and every tiny move could make or break your future. Let's start with step 1 of courtship, being introduced. You can't just go up to someone you find cute and say, "Hey, I liked your cravat. Want to get a drink sometime?" No. You have to be formally introduced by a mutual acquaintance, preferably someone of higher social standing. And if there isn't one, too bad. You may never meet that person at all. You could lock eyes across a crowded ball and feel fate stir in your ribcage, and then never speak to them. Ever. Because no one introduced you. Once you're introduced, carefully, properly, probably with a well-rehearsed line like, "Mr. Edmonds, may I present Miss Wallace?" You're allowed to exchange a few lines of stiff conversation. The weather. The music. How delightful the host's gooseberry tart is. You're not diving into astrology signs or favourite books or whether you've emotionally recovered from that one death in Little Women. Keep it light. Keep it neutral. Keep it about anything other than yourself, your emotions, or your tragic longing. Your one hope. Letters. But even that comes later. The goal of these interactions isn't to get to know someone on a personal level. It's to observe them, their manners, their speech, their posture, their suitability as a spouse. You're evaluating them as a potential lifelong roommate you may or may not love, and with whom you'll be expected to reproduce until your uterus gives out or you die in childbirth. Romantic, isn't it? And the worst part, everyone's watching. You can't not be performing. Your parents are watching. Their parents are watching. The maid dusting the pianoforte in the corner is watching. You're being judged every second for how well you play the part. Too forward, and you're a Jezebel. Too shy, and you're a wet biscuit. You need just the right amount of eye contact, just the right smile. A blush maybe, but not too much. You want to be desirable, not desperate. For men, this dance is just as nerve-wracking. They're expected to lead, but carefully, pursue, but with caution, show interest, but not lust. You may be imagining yourself as a dashing Mr. Darcy type, all smoulder and restraint, but the reality, you're probably sweating into your collar and praying your sideburns are symmetrical. And for women, you're told to be passive, graceful, accomplished. That means you play piano tolerably well, you embroider like a machine, and you never ever appear to have original thoughts. The ideal woman is a delicate creature of mystery, like a porcelain doll who happens to know Latin and will never raise her voice. One historical fact that really shows how absurd this was. There were literal etiquette manuals published to guide people through the courtship process. Like, The Habits of Good Society, and Etiquette for Ladies. These books explained exactly how long a lady could look at a gentleman before seeming immodest. Answer, not long. And how many times a man could call on a woman before being considered forward. Spoiler, fewer than you'd hope. And then there's the letters. Oh, the letters. Once things progress a bit, meaning you've danced together at least twice, you've been invited to her home under supervision, and her father hasn't yet thrown you out the window, you might be allowed to write. But not casually. You don't dash off a, "Hey, thinking about you XOXO. You write full, florid, absurdly restrained letters. They're practically coded documents. You must balance admiration with propriety, compliments with subtlety, any whiff of lust, instant scandal. Fun, quirky fact for you. Some couples used to send messages via flower language. That's right, floriography. Each flower had a meaning. A red rose, love. A yellow carnation, rejection. A daisy, innocence. Entire romantic conversations were conducted in bouquets. Of course, this also meant you had to memorize the flower dictionary and hope the other person got the meaning right. Nothing says romance, like receiving a bunch of marigolds and panicking because you forgot whether that means grief or patience. Now here's where scholars love to argue. Was this all as suffocating as it sounds? Or did people find ways to carve out real connection within the rules? Some point to surviving letters and diaries, full of hidden passion, coded flirtation, genuine longing. Others think that's just literary flair, and that most Victorians were performing roles so tightly stitched, they had no idea who their spouse really was until they'd already married and found out he still sucked his thumb or snored like a freight train. Either way, it's clear that courting, wasn't about getting to know someone. It was about aligning expectations, impressing families, and pretending your emotions didn't exist until given permission. So you're here, halfway through a parlour conversation with someone named Charles, who keeps complimenting your needlepoint. You're not sure if you like him, or if you're just afraid of dying alone in a house filled with doilies. You laugh at his joke about Queen Victoria's hairdresser. Was that a joke? And sip your tea so you don't have to respond. Meanwhile, your mother is watching from the settee, quietly mouthing the word smile at you. And you do. Because the game has begun. So now you're playing the game. You're saying the right things, smiling the appropriate amount, fluttering your lashes with surgical precision. Congratulations, you've officially entered the weirdly exhausting world of being courted. Which basically means you're the star of a reality show where the prize is a lifetime commitment and the producers are your extended family, your entire town, and God himself. And now, as a Victorian man, it's your move. You're supposed to chase, initiate, impress, declare, but not too much. No one likes a man who's overeager. You can't show up at her house uninvited. You can't send too many letters. You can't look too intense across the dinner table. You're a gentleman, not a werewolf, so what can you do? First, you're allowed to call. Not on the phone, don't be ridiculous. You arrive at her house, ideally during the appropriate calling hours, and hand your card to the butler or maid. If she accepts, she'll meet you in the drawing room, where her mother or some conveniently deaf aunt will sit knitting aggressively nearby. You'll talk for 20 minutes about how jolly the weather's been, and how fascinating the bishop's latest sermon was. Then you leave. That's it. That's your big romantic gesture for the day. And of course, there's always the waiting game. You wait to be invited again. You wait to be accepted at another social event. You wait to hear that her mother didn't think you were too loud when you complimented the marmalade. Every tiny misstep could be a relationship ender. You walk on eggshells with a top hat. Now don't get too comfortable in your gendered despair, because if you're a woman, this whole process is even worse. You can't initiate anything. Ever. You're not allowed to show interest, much less desire. You wait, and you hope, and you perform, and you smile when your corset is digging into your spleen, and you'd rather be anywhere else but here, listening to some man explain how a fireplace works for the third time this week. Here's a historical fact for you. Women in Victorian England were legally under the authority of their fathers until marriage, and then under their husbands. So in this little romantic escapade, you're essentially a porcelain doll passed between owners, and the only real power you have is saying no. But even that comes with consequences. Reject too many suitors, and you become a cautionary tale. people start whispering that you're too picky, or worse, difficult. And in Victorian society, being a difficult woman is right up there with being a known arsonist. Men, for all their supposed power, are also trapped in expectations. If you're too rich, people assume you're arrogant. Too poor, you're unsuitable. If you're charming, you're suspect. If you're shy, you're weak. There's a sliver of acceptable personality real estate you're allowed to occupy, and God help you if you step outside it. Oh, and by the way, this whole thing doesn't necessarily mean anyone's actually falling in love. That's not the point. Not really. Love is a potential bonus, like getting a free candle with your purchase of lifelong mutual dependency. This brings us to the rules of pursuit. Because the Victorian man has to be like a falconer hunting with a lace-trimmed glove. You pursue, but you never swoop. You admire, but distantly. You show interest, but vaguely enough that if she shuts you down, you can pretend you were just being polite. But if things are going well, you might get to offer a small gift, flowers, a fan, a book of poetry. Nothing too personal, nothing too extravagant. Too much too soon and you're a creep. Too little and you're forgettable. You're trying to win someone's heart in a system where no one's allowed to admit they have one. And let's not forget, your future in-laws are paying very close attention. The woman's parents are quietly tallying your assets, your family reputation, your likelihood of inheriting something useful. They don't want their daughter ending up with some romantic dreamer who owns 2 suits and a copy of Byron. They want security, respectability, someone who won't get drunk at the hunt and fall off his horse into a ditch, ideally. Here's a weird little fringe fact. There were magazines at the time with mock dating advice columns, mostly satire but disturbingly close to reality. They'd say things like, "Never show your ankles lest your partner imagine your knees," or "A gentleman must never admire a lady's teeth. This implies a familiarity with the mouth, and the mouth is a sacred place." It's hilarious until you realise people genuinely took this kind of stuff seriously. And of course there's debate. Historians argue whether men really held all the power in courtship. Some point to subtle signals, women dropping handkerchiefs, adjusting fans, orchestrating who they'd dance with. That suggests a behind-the-scenes influence. Others insist the male-led structure was rigid and inescapable. Either way, the game was stacked, and everyone had to be very, very good at pretending not to care. So here you are, back at another gathering. Maybe it's a garden party this time. You're sitting stiffly on a wrought-iron bench, your knees politely apart, hands clasped. Across from you is Miss Emily something or other. She's reciting a poem about swans, and you're nodding enthusiastically like it's the most riveting swan content you've ever heard. She glances at you and smiles, just barely. Your pulse jumps. Is that interest? Is that politeness? Is that gas? You compliment her ribbon. She thanks you in a voice so soft it might be a spell. There's a silence. You both know you're doing this for show, and yet, maybe there's something real buried in there. Maybe. You hand her a rose. She says she likes its colour. You try not to grin like an idiot. You know what really spices up courtship? Being a Victorian woman? No, really. If you've ever wanted to live your life as a delicate, over-decorated bonsai tree with zero control over your own pot, this is your time to shine. As a woman, you're expected to be passive, pure, and perpetually agreeable. Not just nice, angelically nice. Like float through the drawing room on a cloud of moral perfection kind of nice. You're not meant to have opinions unless they're about how nice the vicar's sermon was, or how charming it is that your suitor's dog doesn't bite. You are, in essence, a decorative moral compass with a cinched waist. And that waist? Let's talk about it. Because if you're going to be marriage material, you need to have the figure. That means corsets. Tight, brutal, lung-crushing corsets. You're laced in from adolescence, trained to endure discomfort so deeply that you stop noticing it. Kind of like how you're trained to smile politely through any conversation that makes your brain want to leak out of your ears. Now, your education is another story. You're not being taught anything useful per se. Arithmetic, just enough to manage household expenses. Literature, the kind that's morally upright and won't inflame any dangerous ideas. No politics, no philosophy. God forbid you start asking why your entire gender is being treated like a womb with a china collection. Instead, you learn the accomplishments. That's Victorian speak for things you can do in a drawing room without scaring anyone. Playing the piano, watercolour painting, needlepoint, speaking a little French, enough to mispronounce a menu but not enough to have a heated opinion about Rousseau. You're being trained to become the perfect background character in a man's life. Graceful, elegant, decorative, slightly interesting but never challenging, like a fern that knows how to recite Tennyson. Here's a solid historical fact. Women's magazines at the time published endless articles on how to be a proper lady, how to walk without jostling the bosom, how to speak without using vulgar words like leg. Seriously, limb was considered more modest, and how to flirt using only your fan and occasional eye movement. You had to be attractive without ever admitting you wanted to be attractive. It was an emotional striptease wrapped in lace and suffocating social pressure. Now let's talk personality. Do you have one? Shh. No. Not unless it's been pre-approved by society. You can be clever, but not sharp. Witty, but not sarcastic. Kind, but not bold. You're supposed to smile demurely and say charming things like, "Oh dear, how lovely that your cousin keeps pigeons." You can't complain. You can't compete. You can't correct. You are, at best, a gentle breeze in human form. Feeling spicy? Thinking of expressing an opinion? Please don't. Victorians feared outspoken women the way modern people fear pop-up ads for crypto scams. If you do express a controversial thought, say that maybe women should have voting rights, or that men should wash more than once a week, you'll be labelled as a blue stocking or worse, hysterical. You might be prescribed rest, isolation, or a strong dose of stop being difficult. Here's a quirky side fact. Hysteria was a real medical diagnosis back then. Applied mostly to women, of course. Symptoms, mood swings, nervousness, excessive talking, disobedience. The cure? Oh, you don't want to know. Some doctors used pelvic massage. Yes, that kind. While others recommended total bed rest in a room with no stimulation. Either way, the message was clear. If you act outside the acceptable mould, you're broken. And yet, despite the tight constraints, women found ways to signal. They had to. Because even if they couldn't make the first move, they still had preferences, dreams, secret crushes, and a strong desire not to end up married to some dullard who only talks about cricket scores and estate drainage. So they used what they had. Fans, gloves, eye contact, and yes, strategic feinting. If a woman dropped her handkerchief in front of a man, that was basically a romantic grenade. Picking it up and returning it. The start of a flirtation. If she fluttered her fan quickly, it meant she was interested. If she rested it on her cheek, she was thinking about you. If she smacked you with it, well, maybe don't call again. Scholars still argue about how much power women actually had in this mess. Some say women were entirely oppressed, reduced to mannequins awaiting selection. Others point out that women mastered the art of subtle control, choosing who to accept or reject, who to encourage, who to freeze out with the elegant deployment of a disapproving glance. Truth is, both are probably accurate depending on the woman, the class, and whether she gave a damn about the rules. But for you, a typical young Victorian lady, the pressure is crushing. You're trying to smile through your third conversation this week with a man whose best anecdote is about his gout. You can't yawn. You can't excuse yourself. You can't say, "Honestly, Charles, I'd rather spend eternity in a bog than listen to you talk about coal tariffs." You're expected to nod politely, maybe ask a question that shows you're engaged, though not too engaged, or he'll think you're forward. Maybe something like, "Oh? And how long has your father managed the wharf?" delivered in a tone that suggests moderate interest and zero actual passion. And always, your mother is watching. You feel the corset's ribs against your ribs. You feel the weight of the hairpins in your head. You feel the suffocating pull of your entire future, sitting next to you in a waistcoat, explaining his dog's preference for mutton over beef. And you smile, because that's what you've been trained to do. Let's say you've made it past the awkward small talk, past the lukewarm parlour flirting, and now you're officially in the next stage of Victorian courtship. You're writing letters, which sounds romantic, right? Love letters, swoony, candlelit confessions, longing spelled out in elegant loops of ink. Except, spoiler, This isn't Pride and Prejudice. This is bureaucracy with emotions. First, you don't just whip out a pen and go all dear beloved. You need permission, or at least tacit social approval. A gentleman doesn't send a letter to a lady until she's indicated it's acceptable, usually through a chaperoned conversation, a polite verbal cue, or a general lack of visible panic when he mentions possibly corresponding. Any premature correspondence, that's a scandal grenade. A social faux pas so severe you might as well have written, "I wish to destroy your reputation in calligraphy." Assuming it's allowed, let's take a look at what you're writing. A love letter in Victorian England isn't like texting thinking of you. It's a slow-motion trustfall onto a piece of stationery. You're expected to be poetic, but not too poetic, unless you're a poet, and even then you probably shouldn't be. Sentimental, but restrained. Devoted, but not desperate. Emotional, but only in the way a marble statue might be if it briefly contemplated mortality. You start with the greeting, "My dear Miss Blake." Formal, but familiar. Then comes the excessively polite throat clearing, something like, "I hope this note finds you well after the exertions of Lady Kensington's most delightful garden party." Then you write the body of the letter, 2 or 3 paragraphs carefully constructed to hint at admiration, without ever saying anything too direct. If you say, "I adore you," you've jumped ahead to the final boss level. But if you say, "I found our recent conversation on the properties of rosewater most intellectually stimulating," you're playing the long game. Slow, subtle, maddeningly indirect. Here's a very real historical fact. People actually studied letter-writing etiquette. There were guides published for this exact purpose, with sample letters to help you express interest, withdraw politely, or respond with gentle rejection. That's right. There were Victorian templates for getting ghosted. And once you've written your masterpiece, you don't just slap it in the mail and move on. You select your paper carefully. White or cream paper only. No pink unless you want to look tasteless. Your penmanship must be legible and elegant. You fold it into thirds, tuck it into an envelope, seal it with wax, and, if you're feeling especially bold, maybe even scent it lightly with lavender. Just lightly. Over-scented letters are considered vulgar and you wouldn't want to smell desperate, and then you wait, and wait. Because a reply might take a few days, or a week, or never come at all. Every knock at the door, every creak of the post slot becomes an emotional event, and if she does reply, you're reading between every line, analysing punctuation like it's a secret code. She wrote, "Yours sincerely. Is that warmer than yours truly?" She mentioned your letter brightened her morning, but was that just polite filler or a veiled declaration of affection? It's Victorian texting, except slower, smellier, and with a lot more anxiety over ink blots. And while we're on the topic of hidden messages, you should know that lovers sometimes use stationery with secret meaning. Quirky fact incoming. Some paper makers embedded tiny symbols or patterns in their paper that hinted at romantic sentiment. A border of ivy equals fidelity. Violets equals modest love. Forget-me-nots equals well, you get it. It was like writing with emojis, but you needed a magnifying glass and a florist's degree to decode them. Now, not every couple had to rely on letters. If you lived near each other or saw each other frequently through social events, you might talk more in person. But letters allowed for something the stifling drawing room didn't: privacy. It was the only real way you could be alone together, emotionally at least. Letters were where people dared to be vulnerable. Sometimes, carefully, under 20 layers of flowery subtext. Of course, this system came with its risks. A misplaced letter. That could end a courtship. A love note intercepted by a jealous sibling or suspicious mother. That could tank your entire marriage prospects. So people got sneaky. Lovers developed codes, used aliases. Some arranged for letters to be delivered through servants or even street kids with good running legs and loose morals. There's some historical debate over how private these letters truly were. Some scholars argue that, because parents and guardians were so controlling, most people never wrote anything too risque. Others believed that the real feelings were always in the letters. The drawing room was the act, the ink was the truth. Either way, we know one thing for sure. Victorians were absolute fiends for preserving letters. Entire boxes of them. Stacks and stacks wrapped in ribbons, hidden in drawers or pressed into diaries. They were mementos, trophies, time bombs. Because if things went south, those letters could be used against you. Back to you. You're writing your reply now. Maybe you've been nervously rereading his letter, eyes darting to every word like it's about to explode. You've practiced your response 3 times, ripped up 2 versions, and finally settled on one that says just enough, but not too much. You're trying to show warmth without implying you've already picked out your wedding bonnet, and now it's done. Your name at the bottom, carefully signed. Just your initials, or your full name. A flourish. Too much. Better not. Fold it, seal it, and now your heart is in the hands of the postal system. Later you stare at the door, wondering when or if he'll write back. Maybe he's reading your letter right now, holding it like it's something sacred. Or maybe he's analysing your choice of the word agreeable and spiralling into doubt. Either way, you're in. You're writing letters. You're corresponding. You're officially, dangerously close to courtship. You're finally corresponding. You've got your handwritten letters, your careful punctuation, and your growing pile of anxious daydreams. Things are heating up. Or, well, they would be if you were allowed to be within 10 feet of each other unsupervised. But that's not how Victorian dating works. Not even close. Because now, just as you're starting to think, hey, this could actually be something, in swoops your most persistent third wheel, the chaperone. Chaperones are the unpaid, unthanked, ever-watchful sentinels of Victorian society. Their sole purpose is to make sure you and your potential lover never have the chance to do anything interesting. You want privacy? Too bad. You want to talk about anything remotely intimate? Not a chance. You want to kiss someone or even hold hands? Absolutely not. Not unless you want your name carved into the next day's scandal sheet under Fallen Woman, probably ruined forever. Most often, the chaperone is your mother. But she could also be a governess, a very proper aunt, or the terrifying older sister who never smiles and owns too many lace gloves. Whoever she is, she's everywhere. Sitting quietly in the corner while you and your suitor awkwardly sip tea, lurking in the next room while you take a short walk in the garden, popping up like a moral groundhog any time you laugh a little too loudly or linger a little too long at the door. Chaperoning is a full-time job with 0 pay and no benefits, unless you count being in everyone's business as a perk. Now, to be fair, the system's got some logic behind it. Without chaperones, a lot more Victorian babies would have arrived before the wedding bells. But let's not pretend this is just about virtue. This is about control. Because a woman's reputation is the most fragile, easily shattered, wildly overvalued asset in all of England. One hint of impropriety, one rumour, one they were seen alone together, and it's game over. Doesn't matter if nothing happened. Doesn't matter if you were literally just talking about the weather. The perception alone is enough to make marriage prospects vanish like a cold soufflé. Here's a fun historical fact. In some households, even writing letters came with oversight. Daughters were required to show their letters to their mothers before sending them. Imagine trying to flirt while your mum edits for grammar and decency. No, darling, you may not say he has a fine jawline, that's suggestive. Try respectable bone structure. Much safer. And this level of surveillance wasn't limited to the elite. Middle-class families were often even stricter, obsessed with propriety because they were climbing the social ladder and couldn't afford even a whisper of scandal. Working-class women might have had more practical freedoms, jobs, less idle time, but they faced their own judgments, often harsher, and with less protection if things went wrong. Now, let's talk about how this all feels for you, sitting in a room with the person you might want to spend your life with, and their mother. You're trying to express interest with nothing but mild conversation, strategically timed smiles, and maybe a clever comment about his knowledge of turnip farming. All while Aunt Mildred is 4 feet away, pretending to be engrossed in the Times but actually listening to every syllable, like she's recording it for the court. You lean forward slightly, just enough to show engagement. You ask a question. You get a small laugh in response. For a second, your eyes meet. It's electric. It's thrilling. It's... That's the sound of your chaperone reminding you she's still here and ready to throw herself between you and any hint of chemistry. Let's not forget our quirky fringe fact of the day. Chaperones weren't always older women. Sometimes they were awkward little siblings. That's right. If your family didn't have a proper governess or spinster aunt lying around, they'd sometimes assign your younger brother to tag along on walks or visits. So now your 10-year-old brother, covered in jam and obsessed with dead frogs, is responsible for keeping your virtue intact. Good luck with that. Scholars still debate the actual effectiveness of all this chaperoning. Some suggest it created pressure cooker situations where feelings built up rapidly because couples never had time to get bored of each other. Others argue it was the ultimate buzzkill, ensuring that most marriages were based on surface-level interactions and desperate hope. It probably did both. Some couples built real intimacy over long, supervised courtships. Others woke up married to someone they realised they didn't even like, let alone love. So you're stuck. You're trying to forge a connection under the most unnatural conditions imaginable. You're being asked to commit your life to someone you've never seen in casual clothing. You don't know what their laugh sounds like when they're relaxed. You've never seen how they act when they're frustrated, or how they treat waitstaff, or what kind of jokes they make when they aren't being watched like criminals on parole. Still, this is your chance, your window, your only legal and respectable shot at love. So you make the most of it. You ask questions that might reveal a tiny shred of their real personality. You listen closely to every word, every pause, every little signal they slip past the chaperone net. You wonder what it might be like to sit with them alone, to walk together in silence, to hold hands without scandal. You wonder what it would feel like to love someone in a world where you're not allowed to touch them. Later you lie awake in bed and go over the entire interaction in your mind. Did they like you? Did you laugh too loudly? Did your mother notice when you leaned just a little closer than usual? Did he hesitate before saying goodbye? You replay every moment, searching for signs, dissecting silences, hoping that somewhere in all that restraint something real was beginning. And across town he's probably doing the same, because even under layers of rules, surveillance and moral panic, people are still people, still hoping, still trying, still writing another letter. Here's where things start to get frisky. Not physically, obviously. This is Victorian England after all, but socially. Oh yes, your best chance to flirt in public without summoning a social inquisition is through parlour games. Welcome to the world's stiffest dating app. Structured, heavily supervised, and involving an unsettling amount of handkerchiefs and guessing games. You're at yet another evening gathering, the kind where someone plays piano poorly, the tea is tepid, and at least 3 guests have monocles. The air smells like furniture polish and social anxiety. You've done the sitting and the talking and the staring at the floorboards, and now the host chirps, "Let's play a game." This is your cue to perk up, because this awkward, giggly stretch of time between digesting tiny sandwiches and saying goodnight, is the only socially sanctioned opportunity to get a little flirty. You're ushered into the drawing room, where the chairs are rearranged, the rules are explained, and your future happiness may depend on whether you can competently mime Napoleon crossing the Alps without making a fool of yourself. Let's start with charades, the crown jewel of Victorian parlour games. It's not the chaotic free-for-all we know today. It's a highly refined, overly complicated mashup of pantomime and riddles. You might be acting out entire syllables or illustrating proverbs through interpretive shoulder shrugs. No talking, just flailing and blushing. But here's the thing, it's physical. Not in a scandalous way, but in a we are both alive and moving and not made of porcelain way. You're on the floor together, playing, laughing. Your fingers brush as you hand over a prop. You catch each other's eye and share a look. Just for a second. It's innocent. But in a world where even that can count as a thrill, it's basically third base. Historical fact time. Charades and parlour games became insanely popular in the Victorian era, especially after the 1840s, because they were considered safe entertainment. They offered an outlet for social interaction without risking full-on debauchery, but they were also sneakily thrilling. A well-played game of charades could ignite entire courtships, or at least get someone thinking about inviting you for another supervised afternoon tea. There's also blind man's bluff, which is one eyebrow raise away from being Victorian Twister. One player is blindfolded, and the others move around them, teasing and dodging. The goal is to catch someone and guess who it is. The actual goal is casual physical contact in the only acceptable format. Of course, the blindfold always accidentally slips. People fall over on couches. There's giggling. You catch the scent of someone's cologne or the rustle of their dress. Your chaperone clears her throat loudly, and suddenly everyone remembers they're supposed to be playing with the decorum of minor nobility. The Minister's Cat is another classic. Not remotely sexy. It's a vocabulary game where you describe the cat with different adjectives in alphabetical order. The Minister's Cat is an affectionate cat. The Minister's Cat is a bashful cat. It goes on until someone messes up or runs out of adjectives. Great for gauging someone's wit. Terrible for flirting, unless you're turned on by grammar. But back to the juicy stuff, games like Hunt the Thimble or Post Office. Post Office in particular was the Victorian version of Spin the Bottle, though much tamer. Boys go into one room, the post office. Girls come in to deliver a letter and gasp. A kiss on the cheek might occur. Scandalous. These games usually only happened in more relaxed circles or after the older relatives had nodded off in their armchairs. It's like the late-night programming block of a very uptight television schedule. Here's a quirky fringe fact. There were actual etiquette rules for parlour games. That's right. Books like The Sociable, or 1001 Home Amusements. Yes, that's a real title. Laid out proper behaviour for every possible game. If you made too much eye contact during Blind Man's Bluff, that was noted. If your laugh was too shrill during charades, judged. You were meant to enjoy yourself, but not too much, because fun, like everything else, had a moral threshold. Scholars like to argue whether these games were actually romantic or just weird social maintenance rituals. Some say they allowed young people a rare chance to engage freely, creating bonds that could turn into genuine affection. Others argue the games were stiff and over-monitored, doing little more than delaying the inevitable moment when everyone goes home alone and frustrated. But let's not underestimate the power of shared laughter. In a culture where you can't text, can't flirt openly, and can't say what you really feel, those moments of silly, breathless fun during a parlour game might be the only time you and your crush are just two people, not two puppets in an inherited performance. So here you are, on the floor, having just mimed the Lady of Shalott, with dramatic arm gestures and mild personal embarrassment. He claps for you. She laughs a little too loudly at his impression of a sea captain. Someone's aunt tells everyone to keep it down before the vicar hears, and in the middle of it all you feel something shift. Just a little. You're not just a proper young lady or a promising young man anymore. You're funny. You're clever. You're seen. Later, as everyone shuffles into the hall to grab their coats and carriages, he lingers just a second longer than necessary. You meet his eyes. There's a spark. Maybe he'll write tonight. Maybe you'll dream of his laugh. Maybe next time you'll play Blind Man's Bluff and maybe he'll find you. But only if your chaperone doesn't first. Let's talk balls. No, not those kinds of balls. Calm down. We're Victorian now. No, I'm talking dances. Formal, seasonal, extravagantly inconvenient events where hundreds of people cram into chandelier-lit halls to spin around and pretend they're not judging each other. If parlour games were the slow drip of potential romance, balls were the battlefield. This is where it all goes down. Tonight, you're attending one of these massive social showdowns, and you better hope you remembered your fan, your gloves, and all 346 micro rules of ballroom etiquette. Because this isn't just an evening of music and fun. This is a display. This is strategy. This is matchmaking on hardwood floors. The minute you walk through the door, corset cinched to within an inch of your lungs or your cravat straight enough to make your collarbone ache, you're on. You're being observed, judged for how you dress, how you hold your head, how politely you greet the host, that smudge on your glove, social death, that tiny rip in your hem. Someone's gossiping about it already. Your entire body is a resume in satin and starch. The first thing you see, a dance card. It's handed to the ladies. A small booklet with a ribbon tie where potential partners can request specific dances for the night. It's like a danceable to-do list, and it's absolutely critical. Because once your card is full, that's it. You can't add new partners without causing a scene, and if someone important didn't make the list, there will be consequences. You may have just insulted someone's mother without even realising it. Historical fact alert. Dance cards were actually that serious. Some women kept them as souvenirs, marking little hearts next to dances that meant something, scribbling in the margins who stepped on whose feet. They were half schedule, half romantic diary, and they mattered a lot. Now, if you're a man, your job is to ask, politely of course, but not just anyone. You've got to prioritise. If there's a lady your mother wants you to consider, you better request an early dance. That shows interest. You also want to request one of the slower dances later in the evening, like the waltz. Because if you do have feelings for someone, that's where they go. Ah yes, the waltz. Scandalous, intimate, positively un-British, according to some crusty moralists of the time. Why? Because it involves actual close contact. Hands on waists, arms around backs, eye contact that lasts more than 0.3 seconds. There were literal debates in church sermons and etiquette manuals about whether waltzing was the gateway to ruin. Honestly, for Victorian standards, it kind of was. Which is why, when you're invited to waltz, your brain starts short-circuiting. Because this is a big deal. Not quite a proposal, but not a proposal. It says, I want to hold you in public and risk mild social damnation for the pleasure. And if you accept, you're basically saying, yes, I think your breath won't ruin my evening. Let's spin in emotionally charged silence, but don't think the rest of the dances are tame. Every style comes with its own choreography, mood, and of course, strict rules. The quadrille is structured and formal, great for keeping things polite. The polka, a little more playful. The mazurka, you'd better know what you're doing, or you'll look like a total clod in front of half the county. Of course, all this dancing doesn't happen in a vacuum. The chaperones are there too, lining the walls, fanning themselves and making very loud mental notes about who danced with whom, for how long, and whether anyone smiled too much. There's also the ever-present threat of gossip. You leave a dance halfway through because you're dizzy. People will whisper that he offended you. You laugh too loudly after a spin? Scandalous. You trip on your hem and fall into someone's arms? That's a full-blown marriage proposal now. Sorry. Here's a quirky fact that'll make you rethink your footwear. Victorian dance floors were waxed within an inch of their lives. The smoother the slide, the more elegant the movement. But that also meant slipping was common. Men sometimes wore special pads under their shoes for traction. Women? They just prayed they didn't faceplant into someone's cummerbund. And there's some debate, of course, about what all this dancing actually meant. Some historians argue it was little more than ritualised pageantry, a social calendar obligation with no real emotional depth. Others believe the dance floor was where real affection began to stir, where glances became something more, and where a shared moment of rhythm could lead to a lifetime of mismatched expectations and joint estates. Back to you. You're standing against the wall, dance card clutched in your gloved hands, wondering if that one young gentleman with the nice jawline and tragically bad posture will come ask you for the next set. Or maybe you're crossing the floor toward the lady in the sapphire gown, rehearsing your request in your head like a courtroom statement. The music begins. A violin sighs into the opening notes of a quadrille. You hear the scuff of shoes, the murmur of names, the shuffling of couples finding their places. Your name is called. You step into position. And for the next 3 minutes you're spinning, smiling, turning, moving in perfect time with someone you might marry, or never see again, or think about every night for a year and never speak of out loud. It's choreographed chaos. And yet, within the constraints something real flickers. You're both laughing now, quietly, respectfully, but sincerely. His hand grazes yours. You look up. The candlelight makes his eyes a different colour, or maybe that's just the way they look when he's smiling at you. You can't say anything. Not really. But you don't have to. The music is doing it for you. And when the final note plays and everyone claps politely, you curtsy. He bows and you both part ways. Your hands still tingling from a touch that shouldn't have meant anything, but kind of did. So, let's say you've survived the dance floor without tripping, fainting, or accidentally agreeing to a lifelong commitment through prolonged eye contact during a waltz. Well done. Your reward? The next equally nerve-wracking milestone in Victorian courtship, the calling card. You know how today, if you like someone, you might text them, "Hey," and then spend 3 hours over-analysing whether you sounded too needy, too aloof, or like you might be having a medical emergency. In Victorian England, this is that, except it's printed, embossed, and hand-delivered by your footman, who now knows everything about your romantic intentions. Here's how it works. You, the gentleman in question, don't just pop in unannounced. No one pops in anywhere in Victorian society unless they want to be blacklisted. You send a calling card, a small, neat piece of cardstock with your full name printed in tidy black letters. If you're really trying to show off, it might have your address engraved, or maybe even a tasteful flourish of gold around the edge. Not too much, though. Anything too ornate says, "I'm new money and trying too hard." You, or your servant, hand it over to the butler at the lady's residence. The butler then places it on a silver tray and adds it to the day's offerings. Yes, it's basically the slowest, least direct version of swiping right, but with more ribbons. If the lady, or more precisely her mother, approves of your interest, you'll be invited to call in person, at an appropriate time, on an appropriate day, in the appropriate room, with appropriate supervision. If not, you'll either receive nothing back, ghosted, 1800 style, or you'll get one of the more crushing responses, your calling card returned in an envelope. Oof! That's Victorian for LOL no. Here's a historical fact for your collection. The act of leaving and receiving calling cards was so formalised that entire guides were written about it. There were rules about folding corners, literally. If you folded the top right corner of your card, it meant you were delivering it in person. If you folded the bottom left, it might signify congratulations. If it was unfolded, you just sent your regrets. That's right, origami etiquette. It gets more elaborate. If a man visited a house and the woman wasn't home, he'd still leave a card. If she was actually not home, her household would keep the card. But if she just didn't want to see him, her butler might return it. Calling cards were not just paper, they were social chess pieces. And of course, there's the whole card tray drama. Wealthy households displayed the week's calling cards like trophies, or warnings. Guests would glance at the silver tray and size up who had visited whom, and how often. If you saw a rival suitor's card there too many times, yeah, you suddenly had urgent business in the area that required you to drop by unexpectedly. With your own card, possibly embossed, game on. Now, calling cards were also a way for women to subtly express preference. If a young woman returned a man's card quickly and personally, it was a signal. If her response came days later via her mother's maid, it probably wasn't good news. And if her mother responded instead of her, you were being politely redirected into the friend zone, Victorian edition. Here's your quirky fringe fact of the night. Some men took to writing hidden messages on the back of their cards. Yes, despite all the etiquette manuals warning against vulgar familiarity, some suitors would scribble flirtatious notes in tiny cursive on the reverse side. A compliment, a verse of poetry, even a cheeky, "May I hope to see you again soon?" It was like slipping a post-it note into a business envelope and pretending it wasn't a big deal. Now, of course, scholars like to argue over whether calling cards were truly romantic gestures or just more bureaucracy in disguise. Some claim the ritual offered just enough structure for people to safely communicate interest. Others argue it reduced courtship to a glorified filing system where genuine emotion was smothered under a pile of cardstock and over-analysed punctuation. But back to you. You're sitting at your writing desk, examining your new box of calling cards. You run your finger over the slightly raised letters of your name. They smell faintly of ink and expensive intentions. You pick up a few, wondering which ones to leave today, who to approach, what tiny social risks you're willing to take. Later, dressed to the nines and slightly sweating through your waistcoat, you stroll up to the house of the young lady you've been thinking about ever since the waltz. Your hands are damp. Your stomach is doing that thing where it pretends you haven't eaten in 3 days. You nod to the butler, hand over your card and step back. And now you wait. Will she accept? Will she return it? Will her mother respond instead? You walk away pretending it's no big deal. But really your entire emotional state is now tied to a rectangle of paper and whether it ends up in a silver tray or the fire. Let's get something straight right now. In Victorian England, you're not allowed to touch each other. At all. Not even casually. Not even on accident. Unless, of course, you're trying to cause an international scandal and possibly ruin both your families. That's right. No touching. Literally ever. Forget hugs, forget kisses, forget even a casual brush of hands as you pass a teacup. In the land of stiff upper lips and tighter corsets, physical contact before marriage is about as acceptable as setting fire to a church pew while shouting, "I like ankles." This entire world operates on distance. You admire from afar. You flirt using fans and eye contact. You communicate through carefully inked letters and well-timed sighs. But physical closeness? That's reserved for the married, the reckless, or the scandalized. Let's talk specifics. In a public setting, if you're a man and you offer your arm to a woman to escort her across the room or into a carriage, that's fine, as long as it's done in a certain way for a short distance, and you're not smiling too much when you do it. Any touch must appear functional, not affectionate. Romantic? Oh no. Romantic touching is basically first-degree social murder. And waltzing, remember, is already pushing the limits of bodily contact. One hand on her waist, technically her bodice because there's still a layer of fabric and propriety between you, and the other holding her gloved hand. You're inches apart, your breath mingling, her curls bouncing near your shoulder, and society is already on the verge of clutching its pearls. You don't get closer than that unless someone's fainting or being rescued from a carriage accident. Historical fact break. Even shaking hands was limited by gender. While it was common for men to shake hands with each other, it was considered bold, borderline inappropriate, for a man to offer a handshake to a woman unless she offered first, which she usually didn't. Why? Because a handshake implies equality. And we can't have that floating around. So how do people connect? They get creative. There's the classic accidental brush of fingers while handing over a cup of tea, the extra second of eye contact across the room, the dropped glove, deliberate of course, and the gallant act of picking it up. That moment might contain the most exhilarating contact of the entire season. People got good at this, like Olympic-level good. Victorians were experts in the art of almost touching. It wasn't about what did happen, it was about what might. That tension, that breathless maybe, that was the good stuff. And when you couldn't touch, you substituted. You gave small symbolic gifts. You borrowed books and returned them with pressed flowers inside. You exchanged locks of hair. Yes, actual hair. Entire emotional universes were built on tokens like ribbons, handkerchiefs, and the world's most emotionally loaded pocket watch. Here's your quirky fringe fact. There were actually etiquette rules for hand-holding. Not that you were supposed to do it, but in the event that you had to, say, to help someone across a stream, there were correct and incorrect ways to do it. Palms facing up. Acceptable. Interlaced fingers. You monster. Of course, not everyone followed the rules. People found ways to sneak around. Lovers would steal moments behind hedges, in the conservatory, or, if things were really bold, during a crowded dance. Some people actually wrote about their desires in code or shared racy bits of poetry and letters. But these were dangerous games. A single accusation of impropriety could derail an engagement. For women especially, one rumour of looseness could mean social exile. And here comes the scholarly debate. Some historians argue that this intense fear of physical contact didn't kill romance. It intensified it. It made every glance, every near touch, matter more. When you're not allowed to express desire physically, you get real good at expressing it in other ways. Letters, language, poetry, painful, heart-wrenching restraint. Others argue that all this repression did real damage, that it left people emotionally stunted, sexually confused, and so terrified of their own bodies that many entered marriage without the faintest idea of what intimacy even looked like. The truth? Probably both. For some, the lack of touch built a feverish, slow-burn longing that made everything feel profound. For others, it turned relationships into weird, cold performance art where nobody was really sure what to do next. Let's go back to you. You're sitting on a garden bench next to someone you've written 3 letters to and danced with twice. You've memorized the shape of their smile, the sound of their laugh. You can tell what kind of mood they're in by the way they adjust their gloves. You want to touch their hand, just lightly, just once, but you don't. You can't. Instead, you shift slightly closer. Not too close, just enough for your sleeves to brush, a fraction of an inch of fabric touching fabric. Your heart is hammering like you've sprinted up a bell tower. They notice. You know they notice, but neither of you says a word. Later, when you part ways, they offer their hand just briefly. Gloved, of course, you touch it. Soft. Gone. And that's the only physical contact you'll have this month. Maybe longer. Still, you replay it later in bed. That half second. That single contact point. The warmth of it lingering in your memory longer than it probably did in your hand. In a world without casual touch, every touch becomes monumental. And maybe that's what makes it all so intoxicating. Now that you've spent months dancing around each other, literally and metaphorically, you might be wondering, what happens when things get serious? When the letters turn tender, the glances get longer, and you're dreaming of your crush's sideburns or corset laces at 2 a.m? Well, it still doesn't involve touching. But it does involve something even more terrifying. The looming spectre of sex. Ah, yes. Let's wade into those tightly cinched, candlelit, profoundly confusing waters. Because let's be very clear here. You don't know anything. Not really. Not unless someone with no medical training and lots of opinions cornered you in a pantry once and offered a terrifying metaphor about bees and hedgerows. Victorian England was deeply repressed when it came to sex. Not just awkward. Not just modest. I'm talking full-scale social amnesia about how the human body actually works, especially the female body, especially for young women, especially if they were considered respectable. You grew up in a household where you probably weren't even allowed to say the word leg. You said limb, because apparently the mere mention of a thigh might awaken some dangerous lust demons lurking in the wallpaper. Anything below the neck was an implied horror, and anything below the waist. A zone of silence only broken by childbirth or near-death experiences. So when marriage starts to feel like a real possibility, you're suddenly hurtling toward an intimate, legally binding event that you're wildly unprepared for. Emotionally, intellectually, logistically. You don't even know what you don't know. Here's your historical fact of the night. Sex education didn't exist. Not in any real practical sense. There were no school classes, no parent-to-child conversations, no helpful brochures. There were, however, books written by men, mostly for other men, with titles like The Book of Household Management or A Guide to Purity and Health. These contained advice ranging from the scientifically flimsy to the medically insane. Women were often told nothing, or worse, told that good women shouldn't care or even enjoy physical intimacy. Which leads us to the wild belief system floating around at the time. Victorian medicine was obsessed with the idea that women were inherently less sexual than men. A proper lady didn't want sex. She endured it. Lovingly, of course, respectfully, but never enthusiastically. Meanwhile, men were told their lust was natural and barely controllable. Which is always a great combination. One person taught to desire nothing, and the other taught that desire is inevitable and borderline divine. You can see the problem here. Now for your quirky fringe fact. There were actual fears that too much sexual activity would damage your health, especially for women. Some doctors warned that excessive passion could lead to fainting, madness, or even death. Yes, death by orgasm. Victorian doctors, making sex sound like a cursed potion since 1837. Of course, this created massive amounts of pressure, especially for women about to be married. You're heading into your wedding night having no real idea what's going to happen. Maybe you've heard whispers from a scandalous novel. Maybe you've seen a farm animal give birth and drawn horrifying conclusions. But more likely, you've been told to submit to your husband and hope it doesn't hurt too much. Spoiler, it probably will. And for men, it's not exactly smooth sailing either. They might have slightly more knowledge, maybe from some dodgy book or a conversation with an older brother who learned everything from the pub, but they're still fumbling in the dark, literally and metaphorically. They've been told women are delicate, fragile, barely sexual creatures. They have no idea how to approach intimacy with respect or empathy, because no one teaches that. So instead, everything becomes ritualized. You focus on the ceremony, the honeymoon trip, the packing of nightgowns and shaving kits, and you both pretend that the night, that quiet, candlelit, horrifying mystery, is just another part of the itinerary. Some scholars argue that this sexual ignorance was intentional, a way to preserve control. The less people knew, the more they could be shaped into the roles expected of them. Others believe it was just generational fear. Victorian parents genuinely believing they were protecting their children from corruption. Either way, the result was generations of confused, anxious newlyweds with zero preparation and a whole lot of expectations. Back to you. Let's say you're a young woman, newly engaged, and someone hands you a gift, a little white booklet tied with a pink ribbon. You open it. It's called What Every Bride Should Know. It's vague, instructive, written in flowery language that never actually says what it is. It advises you to pray, to be obedient, to offer yourself as a gift to your husband and avoid anything that feels unnatural, which at this point is everything. You close the book, you feel no wiser, just a little more panicked. Or maybe you're the groom, and you've been told to be gentle and lead your wife with firmness and tenderness. You have no idea what that actually entails. You've read one very old Greek poem and skimmed a French book you weren't supposed to have. You're terrified, but also excited, but also terrified. And that's the energy you both carry into your wedding night. Not passion, not confidence, just pure Victorian-grade anxiety. Still, you try. You close the door, you light a candle, you look at each other, finally alone, finally unobserved, and you realise you've spent months being trained for a marriage, and zero time being prepared for the intimacy of it. It's awkward, it's silent, it's not what you expected. But maybe, just maybe, underneath the fear and confusion, you still want to figure it out. Together. Eventually. If you thought the pressure of never touching, never speaking plainly, and entering marriage with the sexual experience of a Victorian chair leg was enough, guess what? You're a woman now, and your entire life has just become one fragile, high-stakes balancing act. Because in Victorian England, there's a golden rule carved into the marble of society itself. Stay a virgin, or stay invisible. Welcome to the wonderful world of virginity or death. Catchy title, right? Virginity isn't just a personal decision in this era. It's a full-blown economic asset. Your purity is your currency, your job application, your social security number, and your family's reputation all rolled into one. And the truly messed up part, no one can even prove it, but everyone thinks they can. And once the suspicion's out there, game over. Let's start with some basics. As a young woman, you're trained from birth to guard your modesty like a cursed treasure. Your behaviour is policed, your wardrobe is scrutinised, your body is hidden, your virtue is talked about like a fine bottle of brandy, untouched, sealed, and to be opened only after the proper ceremony in the privacy of a very awkward marital bedroom. Historical fact time. A woman's reputation in Victorian England could be destroyed by something as simple as being alone with a man. Not even doing anything, just being seen together in the wrong context could start rumours that led to social exile. Actual exile, like pack up your hair ribbons and go live with your least fun relatives kind of exile. Now, this obsession with virginity didn't just affect your dating life, it infected everything. The books you could read, the clothes you could wear, how loud you laughed, whether you danced too much, whether your sleeves were too short, whether your smile was inviting. God forbid someone thinks you're forward. That's code for probably not a virgin, and therefore unfit for marriage. This virginity obsession was tied to the ultimate goal, securing a husband, and if you weren't pure, well, you might as well have leprosy, a gambling problem, and a fondness for French novels, all at once. So you're trained to avoid any and all situations that might suggest impropriety. You're never alone, you're never too friendly. You don't write anything that could be read the wrong way. You don't let your thoughts wander. If your imagination gets a little too colourful, you're told to take a walk or read the Bible or embroider something, until the demons leave your bloodstream. And it doesn't stop when you get engaged. In fact, things tighten. Because now, your virtue isn't just your personal problem, it's your fiancé's investment. Any rumours about you being too affectionate, too friendly with another man, too aware of your own body, that could tank the whole arrangement. His family might pull out, your dowry might be reduced, you might go from future wife to woman of questionable character, faster than you can say, unescorted carriage ride. Here's your quirky fringe fact of the evening. There were actual medical exams some women were subjected to, especially among the upper classes, to confirm their virginity before marriage. These were humiliating, invasive, and based on absolutely no reliable science. But that didn't stop people from using them to prove purity, or justify punishment if the results were, unsatisfactory. And then there's the cruelest twist. Virginity only matters if you're a woman. Because let's be honest, men were not expected to be pure. In fact, men were almost expected to have some experience. Victorian gentlemen might visit brothels, keep mistresses, or engage in what society winkingly called sowing wild oats. And sure, they weren't exactly applauded for it in public, but it was tacitly accepted. Boys will be boys, after all. But if a woman was caught so much as thinking about sex, she was labelled immoral, dangerous, unmarriageable. Men had desire, women had duty. That double standard was baked into everything. Books, sermons, conversations, laws. A man's past could be a bit scandalous, even spicy. A woman's past, if impure, erased her social future. There's debate among historians about just how much wiggle room women really had. Some argue that in private things were more relaxed, especially among certain social groups. Others insist that even the appearance of impropriety could be devastating. The truth probably lives somewhere in the middle. Yes, some women bent the rules, but only the very lucky, very clever, or very wealthy could get away with it. Let's return to you. You're sitting in front of your vanity mirror, hair unpinned, dress unbuttoned, staring at your reflection. Your engagement is official. The ring is on your finger. The future stretches ahead of you like a tightrope, and yet you're afraid. Not of your fiancé. He's fine, kind. He said you looked radiant the other day, which made your stomach flip in a way you're still trying to understand. No, what you're afraid of is expectation. You're about to be touched, looked at, undressed, and everything you've ever been told is echoing in your head. Keep your knees together. Don't ask questions. Good girls don't think about that. You've never seen a man's body. You don't know what will happen. You only know this. You're supposed to be a virgin. Not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually. Anything else is failure. So you pray you've done it right. That you've hidden your curiosity well enough. That your thoughts haven't betrayed you. That your body behaves the way it's supposed to. And the worst part? You feel like you're not even allowed to be excited. Because virginity is not just about what you haven't done. It's about what you're not allowed to want. And that, right there, might be the most Victorian thing of all. Let's just go ahead and rip off the starched monogrammed band-aid. If you're a Victorian man, you can cheat. If you're a Victorian woman, you can't even sneeze seductively without risking total social annihilation. Welcome to the gold-plated double standard of Victorian morality. It's not that men were openly encouraged to be unfaithful, but let's be real. Victorian society expected men to have urges. Boys will be boys wasn't just a tired phrase. It was the entire substructure of male privilege, painted over with some light moral concern and a heavy dose of selective blindness. If you're a man with money and social standing, you can have a mistress, you can visit brothels, you can even, if you're careful, keep a second household. As long as you don't flaunt it, embarrass your wife, or cause an actual scandal, society mostly shrugs and mutters something about manly vigour. Historical fact incoming. Some upper-class men kept long-term mistresses with the full knowledge of their wives. In fact, some mistresses became semi-public figures, living in well-appointed houses and showing up in gossip columns like the lady friend of Lord So-and-so. No one said it was right, but no one really stopped it either. Now, if you're a woman and you so much as blush too brightly at your husband's best friend, congratulations, you've just earned yourself a lifetime of passive-aggressive shunning, a sudden lack of invitations to garden parties, and possibly a long-term stay at a rest home for the morally confused. This is not an exaggeration. Women were held to impossible standards. Once married, they were expected to be sexually available, emotionally patient, and endlessly forgiving, but never ever tempted by anyone else. Fidelity wasn't just a virtue, it was the entire definition of womanhood. And if you broke that rule, society turned on you. Let's say you're a married woman who, heaven forbid, falls in love with someone else. Maybe it's not even physical. Maybe it's just intense emotional intimacy, shared thoughts, stolen glances, letters written in code. It doesn't matter. If discovered, you're done. Because Victorian morality doesn't really do nuance. Your husband, meanwhile, could vanish for a weekend, come back smelling like expensive perfume and bad decisions, and no one would dare bring it up. If they did, they'd probably blame you. Was she too cold? Too demanding? Not cheerful enough? Probably drove him to it. Here's your quirky fringe fact. In 1857, Britain passed the Matrimonial Causes Act, which made it easier for men to divorce their wives. If a husband wanted a divorce, he just had to prove adultery. If a wife wanted one, she had to prove adultery plus cruelty, desertion, incest, or bigamy. That's right. Her husband could sleep with the entire chorus line, and she'd still need extra evidence to even file. So what happens if a woman cheats? First, her reputation is destroyed. She's called a fallen woman, a disgrace, an embarrassment. If she's lucky, she gets exiled from society. If she's unlucky, she loses her children, her home, and any access to money. Her family might disown her. Her friends abandon her. Her name becomes a warning whispered in drawing rooms. Even if her husband was a complete disaster, she is the one who pays. Let's not pretend men were immune to consequences. If a gentleman made his affairs too public, or seduced the wrong debutante, he could face scandal too. But it was rarely career-ending. It was more of a social slap on the wrist. Oh dear, he's terribly inappropriate, isn't he? Anyway, shall we invite him to the next fox hunt? Now here's the scholarly debate. Did women actually cheat? Some historians say yes, of course they did. People are people, and private letters, journals, and court records suggest more than a few illicit romances. Others argue that even if women wanted to stray, the risks were so brutal that most simply didn't dare. The reality? Some women found ways. Quiet affairs with trusted friends, secret rendezvous, letters passed through servants. But those stories are the exception, not the rule. Most women didn't have the luxury of risk. Their whole lives were too precarious. One wrong move could destroy everything. Back to you. Let's say you're a married man, vaguely unhappy but still outwardly respectable. You begin to frequent a certain theatre. There's an actress there. Brilliant, funny, a little bold. You strike up conversation. You send flowers. You call on her discreetly. Before long, there's a quiet understanding between you. You don't love her exactly, but she makes you feel alive, desired, important. No one in your social circle says a word. Your wife, meanwhile, knows. Of course she knows. But what is she supposed to do? She keeps her voice light at dinner. She hosts the parties. She raises the children. She performs the role she was given and pretends it doesn't sting. Because if she stops pretending, she is the one who loses. Now reverse it. Imagine you're the wife, the one feeling invisible, and you've met someone who sees you, a cousin's friend, a kind-eyed doctor, a younger man with too much poetry in his soul. There's chemistry, affection. It's not physical yet, but it could be. You write a letter, but you burn it. Because you know what the world will do if you take one step too far. You're not stupid. You're just lonely. But in this world, he can act on it. You can only dream. If you've made it this far, survived the letters, the chaperones, the fan flirtations, the waxed ballroom floors, and the moral landmines of human touch, you might think you're finally in the clear. Maybe, just maybe, this thing is headed toward love, right? Wrong, because now you need family approval, and if you don't get it, there is no future. Let's paint the scene. You've been corresponding for months. Maybe you've even dared to admit, very indirectly, that you find each other most agreeable. You've danced 3 times, taken one chaperoned stroll through an over-manicured hedge maze, and once brushed elbows in a way that made your heart explode. You're ready to level up. But before you can propose or even talk seriously about the future, you need the big yes. Not from the person you want to marry, but from their entire family, who now function as a human version of a toll gate, and the person standing at the front of that gate. Usually a father, and he's not impressed by your romantic glances or your deep thoughts about daffodils. He wants facts. Income, family background, property, position, prospects. You could be the most charming person in 3 counties, but if your finances are a mess, or your family name was once whispered in a debtor's prison, it's a hard pass. Let's drop in a historical fact. In upper and middle class Victorian society, marriage was as much a business arrangement as it was a personal one. Families looked at a match like a stock portfolio. Will this union increase social standing, add land, strengthen political ties, keep money in the family? Romantic love was optional, strategic alliances, mandatory. Which means your romantic future now depends on how good your family looks on paper. Are you from a noble house, but the 4th son? Tough luck, no inheritance. Are you rich, but your father made his money in trade? That smells like effort. Are you pleasant, kind, solvent, but from the wrong religion? Game over. Even if you and your intended are mentally naming your children and practicing your joint signature, if the parents say no, it's a no. Period. And the horror show runs both ways. If you're a woman and a man wants to court you, he doesn't go to you first. He goes to your father. He formally seeks permission to visit, call, or even write to you. It's like applying for a position that doesn't exist yet. And the job interview is conducted by a man whose hobbies include fox hunting and judging other people's cravats. Even once you're engaged, the approval game doesn't stop. Weddings weren't just a day for the couple. They were giant social advertisements. Every detail, the guest list, the dress, the size of the cake, sent a message about the status and alliances of the families involved. If your side didn't bring enough social clout, people would notice and judge, probably over tea and with raised eyebrows. This whole system becomes even more brutal when the families don't get along. Maybe your beloved's mother thinks you're too forward. Maybe your brother once insulted their second cousin at a regatta. Maybe your family isn't old money enough to satisfy someone whose great-grandfather once owned a castle with no plumbing. You're stuck. And even worse, you can't argue with it. You can't pull anyone aside and say, actually, I think we love each other and that should count for something. They'll smile, nod, say something patronising like, how quaint, and go back to their scheming. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Families sometimes even hired investigators, not officially, but informally, to dig up dirt on potential matches. They'd ask around, read between the lines of gossip, check the parish records, make sure that charming suitor from out of town didn't leave a trail of scandal in Bath or Brighton. Victorian background checks, because nothing says romance like forensic snooping. Of course, not all families were so rigid. Some genuinely wanted their children to be happy. Some saw love as a foundation for a strong union. But even the kind ones still had to think about appearances. Society was a minefield, and one inappropriate marriage could drag down an entire family's social standing. Historians debate just how often families actually blocked marriages. Some say it was rare, that most objections were worked around, especially if the couple was persistent. Others argue that countless love matches were destroyed by parents wielding veto power, like queens on a chessboard. Either way, the pressure to please the family was immense, and the cost of disobedience? Astronomical. Let's go back to you. You've just had the best evening of your life. You walked side by side after dinner. You talked about books, real books, not just whatever was on the drawing room table. You saw them smile at you in a way that didn't feel performative. It felt like a secret. You think, this is it. But then, a letter arrives from their father. Polite, cold, final. He thanks you for your interest, says your character is respectable, your manners admirable. But unfortunately, after consideration, he does not believe the match would be in the best interest of his child, or the family. Your heart drops. You read it again. It doesn't change. You want to reply, you want to beg, you want to say, doesn't it matter what we want? But it doesn't. Not here, not now. So you tuck the letter into a drawer you will not open for a long, long time. And the person you danced with, laughed with, wrote poems to, they'll be married off next season to someone with better connections, and you'll be expected to smile. All right. You've played the parlour games, survived the dance cards, exchanged the world's most restrained love letters, and gotten past the fire-breathing gatekeeper that is parental approval. You've won. You're engaged. You might even be smiling. But here's where Victorian reality slaps that smile right off your face. Because now it's time to remember this fun little truth bomb. Marriage is not about love, it's an economic contract. You heard me. All that romance you've been building up, that slow burn longing, those whispered conversations about music and wildflowers, that's cute, that's fluff. When it comes to the actual marriage arrangement, you and your beloved might as well be shipping crates being weighed and assessed by bored accountants. Welcome to the joyless world of Victorian marital economics, where hearts are optional but financial statements are required. Let's start with the marriage settlement, a document that makes a prenup look like a party invitation. This legal agreement, drawn up between the two families, outlines every single financial detail of your marriage. What the bride brings, dowry, property, inheritance. What the groom brings, land, income, connections. And what will happen to these assets should one of you die, go bankrupt, or turn out to be a criminal hiding in a cravat. Love doesn't even get a footnote. You, the bride, are basically being transferred. Not sold, heaven forbid we use such vulgar words, but settled, like a polite business arrangement between gentlemen over tea and ledgers. Historical fact time. Marriage settlements often included jointures, which were provisions for the woman should her husband die before her. Sounds nice, right? Like a built-in security blanket? Sure, unless you remember that women couldn't own property after marriage. The moment the vows are spoken, all your financial rights are swallowed into your husband's legal identity. You become, quite literally, a legal non-entity known as a feme covert, which means your dowry, your life savings, your precious inheritance, that land your great-aunt left you, it's now his. You don't get a say in how it's used. He can invest it, spend it, gamble it, or buy a marble statue of Julius Caesar for the garden. And if he loses it? Oops. Hope you weren't planning on eating in your old age. For the groom, marriage means a boost, especially if you're marrying a wealthy or well-connected bride. It's like upgrading your software, your house, and your resume all at once. Suddenly you're being invited to better hunting weekends. Your name is mentioned in the better circles. Your credit improves because people assume you've inherited her father's good sense and coin purse. And don't think this system only applies to the upper classes. Middle-class marriages were also deeply transactional. A respectable match meant consolidating resources, ensuring the family business stayed afloat, maybe securing that second parlour your mother's always wanted. For working-class couples, marriage was a practical partnership for survival. You didn't marry for love, you married for help. Someone to watch the kids, bring in wages and keep the bread from burning. Here's your quirky fringe fact. There were marriage brokers, real-life matchmakers for the upper classes, who specialised in arranging matches based on wealth, title and family name. They'd circulate gossip, analyse inheritance lines, and pair up eligible young people like prize livestock. If you think dating apps are soul-crushing now, imagine swiping right based on who owns the bigger turnip field. Now, there's a twist to all this. Some people did marry for love, or at least affection, but it was rare, especially among those with titles or fortunes to protect. For the few couples who found both love and money in one package, great. But for most people, love was what came after, if at all. Some historians argue this made relationships more stable. If your marriage wasn't based on passion, it couldn't fall apart when the passion cooled. You weren't expecting fireworks. You were expecting civility, stability, and maybe, after 20 years, a fond kind of indifference. Others argue it was a recipe for lifelong emotional starvation, with people silently pining away under the same roof, trapped in a union built on social math and legal jargon. Back to you. You're sitting across from your fiancé. You've just come from a meeting with your solicitor, who used the word estate more times than you thought possible in a single sentence. You smiled politely as your father negotiated your financial future like it was a rug at a market. You're now worth exactly £2,000 and a small house in Surrey. Romantic, isn't it? Your fiancé takes your hand, gloved of course, and says something about how happy he is. You believe him. You want to believe him. You want to think this is more than property exchange in a waistcoat, but you know what this is. You know what you are now. A partner in a contract. A name on a document. a sum of money attached to a dowry. You know, the only reason you were allowed to fall in love with him at all was because your financial boxes were already ticked. And so you smile, you say you're happy too, because maybe if you say it enough it will start to feel true. If marriage is an economic contract, and it absolutely is, no matter how many poems he wrote in your autograph book, then you better believe there's a price tag involved. And I'm not just talking about the ring, the dress, or the 12-tier cake that tastes like despair and stale almonds. Nope. Tonight we dive into the cheery world of dowries and bride prices, because nothing says romance like calculating a woman's value in pounds, sterling and parcels of land. Let's start with the basics, the dowry. A dowry is the money, property or goods that a bride's family gives to the groom, or the groom's family, upon marriage. It's not a gift. It's not a donation. It's an expectation. And in Victorian England, the size of your dowry could make or break your entire romantic future. Got a big dowry? Congratulations. You've just been upgraded from acceptable to desirable. You now have access to better suitors, better invitations, better everything. That awkward laugh and average bone structure? Suddenly charming. Because behind your fluttery fan and heavily embroidered skirt is a pocket full of promise. Got a small dowry? Oof. Now you've got some serious charm work ahead of you. Maybe you play piano really well. Maybe you're unusually witty. Maybe your father claims you'll inherit more later. But we all know that's Victorian speak for she comes with some teacups and a strong work ethic. Let's drop in a historical fact. Dowries were common across many cultures, but in Victorian England they were especially rigid among the upper and middle classes. Families would begin saving for their daughters' dowries from birth. The more daughters you had, the more financial dread you lived with. In fact, having too many girls could financially cripple a family. So yes, if you were the third or fourth daughter, you were the human version of a budgeting spreadsheet gone wrong. Now contrast that with the bride price, which wasn't typically English but was practiced in other cultures, and sometimes whispered about with horror in Victorian drawing rooms. Instead of the bride's family paying the groom would pay them. The Victorians thought this was barbaric, of course, because it looked too much like purchasing a wife outright, which is hilarious considering they were doing the same thing, just with more silk ribbons and legal paperwork. Here's where things get extra bleak. The dowry wasn't just about social climbing, it was insurance. If your husband died, mismanaged the family fortune, or simply decided to be terrible, a popular Victorian hobby, your dowry was often all you had to fall back on. But remember, legally, you didn't own it anymore. He did. Unless your marriage settlement had a specific clause protecting it, and many didn't, that safety net could vanish like a gentleman at the mention of emotional vulnerability. And for men, a large dowry could mean everything. Maybe you're the second son. No inheritance, no title, just a modest position in your uncle's law office and a growing collection of handkerchiefs. But you meet a lovely girl with £10,000 tied to her name, and suddenly you're a viable prospect. You marry her, use her money to buy a country house, and voila, you're a gentleman now, upgraded via matrimony. Now, if you're thinking, this sounds like a glorified auction with better floral arrangements, you're not wrong. Victorian courtship was like a very genteel version of Shark Tank. You pitch yourself, good manners, decent face, tolerable lineage. The other side evaluates, what's the investment? What's the return? Will this union boost the family's prestige? If yes, proceed to candlelit dinners and waltzes. If not, rejected, like a bad loan. Here's your quirky fringe fact for the night. There were Victorian dowry calculators published in magazines and etiquette guides. These weren't literal calculators with buttons, though that would have been amazing, but articles that suggested how much dowry was appropriate for different levels of gentry. Daughter of a knight? That's about £5,000. Merchant's daughter trying to marry into nobility? Better come with 10 times that. It was matchmaking by math. And what happens if a woman doesn't have a dowry? If she's lovely, intelligent and full of potential, but her family's money ran out after paying for her sister's wedding and her brother's Oxford degree? She becomes what they call a poor match. Not just poor in money, but in value. This is where a lot of Victorian women's stories end. Not because they don't deserve love, but because love isn't what gets you married. Not really. If you're lucky, A distant cousin might propose out of duty. If you're very lucky, you might attract a wealthy man with a rebellious streak and a fondness for charity cases. Otherwise, you're on the path to spinsterhood, which we'll get to. Oh, we'll get to that. Back to you. You're sitting in the drawing room, posture perfect, trying not to sweat into your gloves as your father discusses your dowry with the family solicitor. He says your mother brought £7,000 into their marriage, and he'd like to match that. But things are tight. The investments haven't performed. The cousin with the shipyard defaulted. Maybe £5,000, maybe less. You try not to look like you're listening, but you are. You know what this means. It means the better suitors, the ones with carriages and titles and inherited wallpaper, they won't even glance your way now. It means the one man who looked at you with real interest last week at the ball, his mother will steer him towards someone else, someone with numbers behind her. It means your future is shifting, recalculating, narrowing. You're not just a person, you're a package. And tonight you'll go back to the ball and smile like nothing has changed. But you'll know your price. So let's say you don't marry. Maybe your dowry was too small. Maybe your family fell from grace. Maybe you just didn't like any of the carefully curated men who stood near you at garden parties pretending to understand poetry. Or maybe you dared, gasp, to be a bit too picky. Whatever the reason, the result is the same. You are now a spinster. Take a breath. Try not to faint. It's not the plague, it's worse. Being a spinster in Victorian England is not simply a relationship status. It is a full-blown identity crisis, a diagnosis, a public service warning. The word alone conjures up images of lonely women in lace collars surrounded by cats, embroidery hoops, and barely repressed bitterness. If that sounds like your dream life, I've got great news. Otherwise, oof, you're over 25, unmarried. Your season has passed. Your dance card is empty. The whispers have begun. Poor thing, they say. Such a shame. She had such a lovely complexion in her youth. You're now viewed less like a person and more like a very decorative, very expired vase. Let's start with the term itself. Spinster. Originally, it just meant a woman who spun thread, an actual job. But by the Victorian era, it had evolved into a not-so-subtle insult. Now it means unmarried, unwanted, and possibly full of dangerous opinions. If people are being kind, they call you a maiden lady. If they're not, they say she never had the chance, and look sad for exactly 1.5 seconds before asking about your younger, more marriageable sister. Here's your historical fact. According to census data from the late 1800s, about 1 in 4 middle and upper-class women in Britain never married. That's a lot of old maids, supposedly haunting drawing rooms in perpetual disappointment. But the truth is more complicated. Some chose independence. Some couldn't afford the financial hit. And some just didn't meet anyone who didn't make them want to jump into a lake. Still, the stigma was real. A married woman had status. She was someone's wife. She had a role, a household, a title, Mrs. Something or Other, a spinster. She was an accessory, a fixture. Maybe she lived with her parents, caring for aging relatives. Maybe she was shuffled between married siblings like a well-mannered ghost. No home of her own, no income of her own, just polite smiles and slowly tightening social wallpaper. Of course, there were exceptions. If you were wealthy enough or unusually well connected, you could live independently, maybe even own property. But for most women, not marrying meant financial instability. There were no husbands to provide, no legal access to your father's or brother's fortune. You might be educated, intelligent, even talented, but without a ring on your finger, society saw you as unfinished. Now here's your quirky fringe fact. Victorians published entire manuals for unmarried women, titles like The Complete Guide for the Unattached Lady or A Spinster's Path to Grace. These books offered helpful tips like devote yourself to good works and cultivate inner beauty, which is Victorian for don't complain, and maybe teach children for the rest of your life. You were encouraged to be useful but never too visible, charitable but not ambitious, independent but not threatening. Basically, exist quietly. and try not to remind people that you exist outside the confines of marriage. Because every time you walk into a room, you remind them of a terrible truth. Not everyone gets picked, and scholars have plenty to say here. Some argue that the spinster image is overblown, that unmarried women carved out powerful roles in their communities, leading charities, running schools, living richly independent lives. Others say those cases were rare, and that most spinsters were caught in a net of social condescension, quietly fading into the background as younger women replaced them on the marriage carousel. The truth? Probably both. Some women turned spinsterhood into strength, others were crushed by it. Back to you. You're 28 now, still beautiful in a way. You know how to manage a household. You write excellent thank you notes. You read novels and have opinions you never say out loud at dinner. You get invited to things, but less often, and always with that faint, pitying tone. You've heard the whispers. She was engaged once, wasn't she? No dowry, poor dear. Refused that baronet in 72. Regrets it now, I'd wager. You go to weddings and smile. You give thoughtful gifts and drink tea with the other women. The married ones talk about their children, their husbands' latest obsessions with gardening or parliamentary votes. You nod politely, add nothing, and go home alone. You've stopped receiving love letters. You've stopped hoping for them. But sometimes, late at night, you open the box under your bed. Inside are the old calling cards, a dried rose, one letter, folded carefully, creased at the edges, slightly yellowed. You read it again. You let yourself remember. Because you're a spinster now. But once, for a moment, someone asked to dance. So, you did get married. You checked all the boxes. Dowry, delivered, proposal, secured, wedding, lavish, reputation, intact. For a moment there, you thought you'd made it safely into the warm embrace of Victorian respectability. But then, plot twist, he dies. Or maybe he drinks himself into an early grave, or falls off a horse, or contracts one of the many exciting and untreatable 19th century diseases named after old men and sad poets. Either way, you are now a widow. Now you'd think widowhood might come with some freedom, right? You've done your duty. You married. You were respectable. You hosted dinners and smiled politely and probably produced a small flock of children. And now, with your husband 6 feet under, you can breathe again. Well, sort of. Because being a widow in Victorian England is its own very specific kind of tightrope walk, where every step is judged, and the fall is just a heartbeat away from scandal. Let's start with mourning. You don't just cry a few times and move on. You're expected to perform grief like it's a full-time job. Black dresses, black gloves, black veils, black bonnets. If you can drape it in crepe and wear it without smiling, it goes on your body. Historical fact alert. There were official rules for mourning, laid out in etiquette manuals and followed with military precision by the upper and middle classes. A widow was expected to wear full mourning for at least a year, meaning head-to-toe black, no jewellery, no fun. Then you could graduate to half mourning, which let you add in some grey or lilac, edgy, while still signalling your ongoing sorrow. And if you dared to step out of mourning too soon, people noticed, people talked. You were either disrespectful or suspiciously eager to move on, which was code for, she probably killed him with a slightly undercooked pie. On the other hand, if you mourned too long, you were called maudlin, melodramatic, a drain at parties. So you're stuck in a weird zone of appropriate grief which requires you to look devastated but not deranged, lonely but not needy, modest but still reasonably attractive in case there's a second husband lurking in the drawing room. Oh yes, remarriage is an option, but again only on society's terms. If you remarry too quickly, especially if the new husband is younger or wealthier or suspiciously handsome, people start doing math. But wasn't it only 6 months since poor Edgar passed? Did you see how she smiled at the funeral? She must have been planning this all along. However, wait too long, and the eligible men forget you exist. You become an eternal mourner, the woman in black sipping tea by the fire, haunting her own youth. It's a narrow window and you better time it right. Now here's the quirky fringe fact. Mourning fashion became so popular in the Victorian era that entire industries sprung up around it. Mourning dressmakers, mourning jewellers, Mourning photographers. You could get lockets filled with your late husband's hair, gross, or brooches made from jet, a black gemstone mined specifically for this purpose. There were catalogues, advertisements, trends. Grief was a fashion statement. And then there's the financial side. If your husband left you well provided for, you might finally have a taste of independence. You might inherit a home, a stipend, a bit of land. You could become the mysterious widow with a pension and a private garden, living on your own terms at last. But if he died in debt, if the marriage settlement wasn't generous, if your dowry vanished in a bad investment or a poorly timed duel, then widowhood becomes poverty with a crepe veil. You may need to rely on your relatives. Move in with your married sister. Hope your children marry well enough to drag you along behind them like a sentimental trunk. And don't even think about working. Not if you want to stay respectable. Employment is for governesses and desperate widows. You're supposed to live quietly, spend modestly, and stay in your lane. You can own property now. Hooray! But God forbid you act too confident about it. Scholars argue over how empowering widowhood actually was. Some say it was the only phase of a woman's life where she had real autonomy. No father, no husband, no chaperone. Just a long stretch of quiet, if lonely control. Others say that was only true for the wealthy. That for most women, widowhood was simply another cage, painted a darker colour with even fewer parties. Back to you. You're standing in front of your mirror dressed in black. Your hair is pinned up, your eyes are tired, and your hands still shake when you button the final clasp on your morning gown. People have been kind, mostly. They send flowers, they whisper condolences, but their eyes already ask the next question. Will she remarry? You're only 31. That makes you young in widow terms, attractive enough to catch someone new, but only if you don't seem too eager. You receive calling cards, polite visits, letters from family friends who just happen to be unattached. You're in mourning, but you're also eligible. Again. And you can't help but wonder, do I want to do it all over again? The letters, the dances, the dowry negotiations, the silence, the pressure, the vulnerability of it all. Or do I want to be left alone? You sip your tea, stare out the window and ask yourself the most dangerous question a Victorian woman can ask. What if I chose myself this time? Let's say you've played the game. You did everything right. You were polite, presentable, pure. You married the acceptable man, wore the correct number of black veils when he died, and now you're navigating society's expectations with the delicacy of a tightrope walker in a hoop skirt. But then, one day, you trip. Maybe someone sees you speaking to the wrong man behind a hedge. Maybe your letter to a friend is intercepted. Maybe you slip on the rules, let your laugh linger too long, or dare to be seen riding in a carriage without a chaperone. And just like that, you're done. Because in Victorian England, one whiff of scandal can end you, and it doesn't matter if it's true. The mere suggestion that you've acted improperly is enough to sink you like a marble umbrella stand into the River Thames. Here's how it starts. It might be a glance, a whispered comment. Someone raises an eyebrow at the way you and Lieutenant so-and-so were talking at the garden party. Someone else says they saw you walking, alone, on the East Terrace. The facts don't have to line up. The story doesn't need a beginning, middle, or end. It just needs momentum. Victorian society thrives on gossip, especially among women who, let's be honest, were given very few official tools of power. So they sharpened what they did have: reputation, rumour, and the finely honed art of the polite takedown. It's a social blood sport, and once your name hits the circuit, it travels faster than cholera in a tenement house. Historical fact break. The Victorian press absolutely loved scandal, especially among the upper classes. Newspapers, society columns, and privately printed pamphlets would publish hints, initials, or flat-out allegations about adulterous affairs, improper conduct and broken engagements. Some papers even had blind items, teasing the public with gossip just vague enough to get away with. And once your name showed up there, it might as well be carved on a gravestone. Even if you're innocent, especially if you're innocent, the damage is done. People won't confront you. Oh no, that would be vulgar. Instead, they freeze you out. Invitations stop arriving. Ladies whisper when you enter the room. Gentlemen who once lingered near your elbow now avoid you like you're contagious. You've become a scandal, And in a world where social life is everything, that's worse than death. It's erasure. And it's not just reputational. There are real, lasting consequences. If you're unmarried, your marriage prospects evaporate. Your parents are mortified. Your younger sisters suddenly look a lot less attractive by association. You've tainted the family brand. If you're married, things get even messier. Your husband might accuse you publicly, might take you to court, might even have you locked away, especially if he claims hysteria or emotional instability. And who isn't emotionally unstable after being ghosted by all of London? This brings us to one of the most chilling elements of Victorian scandal culture, the asylum card. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Victorian men could have their wives committed to an asylum for reasons as vague as melancholy, nervousness, or inappropriate behaviour. And guess what counted as inappropriate? Writing passionate letters, reading too much, crying at the dinner table, flirting with someone who wasn't your husband. A scandal didn't just ruin your social life, it could literally get you institutionalised. And once you're in, good luck getting out. The treatment for female madness often involved rest cures, translation, forced bed rest and isolation, cold baths, moral lectures, and in the worst cases rudimentary shock therapy, all because you were seen alone with a man who might have once looked at your ankle. Now, scholars have long debated whether Victorian society truly believed in these gendered punishments, or just used them as tools of control. Some argue the obsession with female purity and propriety was deeply internalised. Others see it as a deliberate system designed to maintain power, a way of making sure women stayed quiet, compliant, and utterly dependent. Either way, the result is the same. Scandal doesn't just remove your access to society, it removes your voice. You can't defend yourself without seeming defensive. You can't protest without looking unhinged. Your silence is interpreted as guilt. Your anger is proof. And let's be real, men don't suffer the same way. If a man is caught in a scandal, it's a temporary inconvenience. Maybe he has to leave town for a bit. Maybe he gets reassigned to another post. But there's always redemption. Boys will be boys, after all. And didn't she tempt him? Didn't she know what she was doing? You, on the other hand, are now the cautionary tale. Mothers use your name as a warning. Don't end up like Miss X. You know what happened to her. Your story is retold, reshaped, distorted, until even you forget what really happened. Back to you. You're sitting at your writing desk. A half-finished letter lies in front of you, one you'll never send. The candle flickers, casting shadows on the lace curtain. You haven't left the house in 3 days. The invitations have stopped. Your father avoids looking at you. Your mother keeps sighing. You know the rumour isn't true, but it doesn't matter. Truth has nothing to do with it. You think about running away, changing your name, moving to the coast, maybe teaching, maybe vanishing. But then what? You'd still be a scandal, just a quieter one. You take a breath, fold the letter, burn it, and tomorrow you'll pretend it doesn't hurt. Because in this world, being innocent is not enough. You have to look it, sound it, be it, every minute, every day, forever. Sometimes love doesn't play by the rules. Sometimes you're not content to wait through endless dances and letters and veiled conversations about rainfall. Sometimes you don't want your future decided by dowries, dinner guests, or how many cousins your mother has blackmailed into recommending you. Sometimes you just want to run. So you do. Welcome to the wild and scandalous world of secret elopements, the last refuge of the desperate, the romantic, and the dangerously impatient. Let's set the scene. You're in love. Real love. Not the suitable marriage prospect with 2 horses and a reliable chin kind. The kind that makes your pulse go sideways. The kind that keeps you up at night, writing bad poetry in the margins of etiquette manuals. But there's a problem. His family disapproves, or yours does, or both. Maybe he's poor. Maybe you're poor. Maybe your father thinks he smiles too much and therefore lacks discipline. Whatever the reason, your love is a no-go. And the social machinery is already grinding into place to separate you forever. So what do? You grab your cloak, your courage, and you elope. Now, you don't just head to the nearest registrar's office. This is Victorian England, and marriage isn't something you can just casually do. There are laws, witnesses, procedures. But there is one place where tradition melts just enough to let you sneak through the cracks. Say it with me now, Gretna Green. Historical fact alert. Gretna Green was a small village just over the Scottish border where couples from England could marry without parental consent. Scotland had much more relaxed marriage laws. As long as both parties were over 16 and willing, they could be wed on the spot, no waiting period, no bans, no parental blessing. Just two people, a blacksmith with a flair for theatrics, and a whole lot of adrenaline. It became the elopement capital of Britain. And yes, I said blacksmith. Gretna's famous anvil priest was often just a local blacksmith who officiated in the workshop, striking the anvil as part of the ceremony. Symbolic, loud, legally binding. It's less dearly beloved and more hammer time. But hey, when you're fleeing social ruin, you don't ask for lace and lavender. Couples would flee by carriage, often in the dead of night, dodging questions and chaperones and angry fathers. The journey north could take days, and if someone got wind of the plan, it might turn into a full-on chase. It was like Romeo and Juliet, but with worse roads and more petticoats. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Some inns along the route from London to Gretna Green became known as elopement stops. They kept extra horses ready. Their staff knew how to be discreet, and they'd serve nervous couples tea, whisper encouragement, and, in at least one case, help falsify arrival times in the guest log to throw off pursuers. Basically, early Victorian ride-or-die energy. But Gretna wasn't the only escape. Some couples eloped to the Channel Islands, or even France, though that added a whole new level of paperwork and language panic. Others simply found a less strict English parish, maybe in Wales or a remote corner of the country where the vicar was too old to care. Of course, elopement came at a price. You could kiss your family goodbye. You'd be disinherited, disinvited, and disapproved of. You might be cut off socially, financially, emotionally. You might not even be legally recognised at first, depending on how shady your officiant was. And your children, they could face questions about legitimacy and inheritance for decades, especially if you were a woman. Because while Victorian men could recover from a youthful indiscretion, i.e. us marrying for love, women were less lucky. A secret wedding without approval made you dangerous, untrustworthy, probably hysterical. Even if your elopement turned out to be a lifelong romance, society never fully forgave a woman for taking charge of her own destiny. Now, scholars debate whether elopements were mostly about passion or pragmatism. Some couples genuinely believed they were star-crossed and defied the odds out of sheer, breathless love. Others saw elopement as a last-ditch solution to unfair economic or class barriers. Love might have been real, but so was the reality that waiting would lead to an arranged marriage with someone who smelled like pickled radish and talked about pig prices over dinner. And sometimes, people just made dumb, hasty decisions. Love has never been known for its timing. Back to you. You're standing in a drafty room above a country inn, staring at the rain-soaked road. You've been travelling for 12 hours. You've nearly been caught twice. Your boots are ruined. Your hair looks like you've wrestled a goose. But beside you, he's holding your hand. You look at each other. You sure? He asks. You nod. The blacksmith's downstairs. You descend the stairs together, fingers still clasped, and the sound of rain drumming on the window feels like a war drum and a lullaby all at once. You say your vows by firelight. The blacksmith strikes the anvil. The sound echoes. Something final. Something thrilling. It's done. You're married, no ball gown, no orchestra, no flowers. Just love. Risky, messy, unapproved love. And for now, that's enough. But you know the world won't stay quiet forever. And when you return, they'll be waiting. So you've done the unthinkable. You eloped. You didn't wait for permission. You didn't get the blessings. You ignored the dowry drama, the gossip circles, the disapproving glances of relatives with names like Lady Agatha and Colonel something hyphenated. You followed your heart. Oh. But before we cue the violins and fade to black, let's talk about the part the storybooks leave out. You see, just because you're married doesn't mean you're safe, not in Victorian England. Because you and your new spouse, you didn't just cross county lines, you crossed class lines. And that, my friend, is where the real trouble begins. Victorian society was built on class. Not just income, but blood, title, occupation, accent, posture, grooming habits, and how convincingly you could pretend to enjoy boiled mutton. Marrying outside your class wasn't just unconventional, it was socially radioactive. It threatened the very architecture of the polite world, and polite society hates being threatened. Let's look at the three major classes: upper, middle, and working. Upper-class families were aristocrats, landowners, the titled elite. They hosted balls in homes with names like Ashdown and Brackenfell. They didn't work, at least not in the sweaty, labouring sense. Their lives were built around appearances, lineage, and the ongoing project of making sure their children married people whose ancestors hadn't owned a shop. The middle class was a rising force during the Victorian era. Merchants, bankers, industrialists, professionals, doctors, lawyers, architects. They had money, but not always pedigree, and they were obsessed with climbing, proving they were just as refined as the people above them, which meant they were even more rigid about behaviour. Nothing screams respectable like fragile pride and a subscription to 5 etiquette journals. And the working class. They were the labourers, the servants, the seamstresses, the coal miners, the people who made the empire run but rarely got to touch the silverware. They married for practicality, for survival, for shared rent and joint bread. So imagine what happens when you, a nice middle-class daughter with a small dowry and a decent piano technique, fall in love with a servant, or a stable boy, or a charming clerk with nothing to his name but good cheekbones and a suspiciously vague backstory. It's social suicide, not because you've done anything illegal, but because you've broken the script. You've ignored the expectations, the matchmaking, the calculations. You've gone rogue. And society has a way of punishing those who think rules don't apply to them. Historical fact time. Class-crossing marriages were rare and controversial. One of the most famous real-life examples? Lady Elizabeth Foster, later the Duchess of Devonshire, scandalised society by having children with a man below her station, and the fallout was brutal. Her reputation never fully recovered, despite her eventual title, because once you cross the class line, there's no coming back. Here's your quirky fringe fact. There were manuals published warning young women, especially from the middle class, not to fall in love with those below their station. Some included handy tips like, avoid excessive time in the servants' quarters, and do not mistake politeness for affection. Because clearly, if you're nice to a footman for 5 seconds, it's all over. Wedding bells by Tuesday. Now some scholars argue that class mixing happened more than we think, especially in the later Victorian period, when industrial wealth started to blur the lines between old money and new. Others insist the boundaries were fiercely policed, especially by women who had the most to lose in terms of social standing. The truth? It depended on how discreet you were. It also depended on how willing you were to pay the price. Back to you. Let's say you've married someone beneath you. Maybe he was your family's coachman. Maybe she was the daughter of a tenant farmer with a face that haunted your dreams for months. You ran off together. You said the vows. You chose love over logic. You're living in a small cottage now. No staff, no parties. Just the two of you, a tea kettle, and a lot of quiet evenings trying to pretend you don't miss the comfort of clean linens or not having to milk your own goat. You get by. But then one day, you walk into the village and bump into an old acquaintance. She stares at you, eyes flicking over your modest dress, your worn gloves, your new name. She smiles. It's not a nice smile, and the gossip begins again. She married him. What happened to all her prospects? I heard they live in a converted stable. And it doesn't stop. It follows you everywhere. At the market, in church, even in your own head. You start to wonder, did I make the right choice? You love them. You do. But love doesn't refill the coal bucket. Love doesn't stop people from crossing the street to avoid you. Love doesn't stop your own mother from signing her letters, Mrs. W. Henderson, instead of your loving mother, as if even her closing can't forgive what you did. And yet, when you go home, they're there, making tea, smiling at you like none of that matters. You share a quiet joke. You eat soup in mismatched bowls. You go to bed in a room that creaks. It's not perfect, it's not grand, but it's yours. And for now, that's enough. Let's shift the lantern a little and look at the part of Victorian love life that almost no one dared to say out loud, let alone write into a diary or whisper in the hallway between embroidery lessons and etiquette reviews. You might not see it in the etiquette manuals or the dance cards or the stern portraits of stiff-lipped ladies and side-parted gentlemen staring solemnly into your soul, but it was there, hidden, real, risky. Because if you were someone who fell in love with the same sex, or even suspected you might, congratulations, you've just entered the terrifyingly tight-laced world where gay love was illegal. Yes, illegal. Not scandalous. Not frowned upon. Not a little quirky. Literally a criminal act, punishable by prison, hard labour, and complete destruction of your social life and personal safety. So if you thought dating sucked for straight people in corsets and cravats, imagine what it was like when your love could get you locked up. Let's take a quick stroll through the legal horror portion of our story. Historical fact. In 1885, Britain passed the Criminal Law Amendment Act, which included Section 11, aka the Labouchere Amendment. This made gross indecency between men a criminal offence, regardless of whether it happened in public or private. You didn't have to be caught in the act, just suspected, accused, or found, with letters too affectionate for society's comfort. That's right. Men could go to prison for kissing, or writing love notes, or being a little too close with a friend. And women? Technically, lesbianism wasn't illegal. Why? Not because society was progressive or respectful. Oh no. It was because the law simply refused to acknowledge it existed. Queen Victoria herself reportedly didn't believe women could do that sort of thing, which frankly tells you more about Queen Victoria's imagination than it does about sapphic possibilities. But don't be fooled. Just because it wasn't criminal doesn't mean it was safe. Women who fell in love with women still risked their reputations, their homes, and often their mental health. If caught, they might be institutionalized, disinherited, or subjected to corrective treatments. At best, they were told it was a phase. At worst, they were erased. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Many queer Victorian individuals formed what were called romantic friendships. Deep, affectionate relationships between people of the same gender that were intense enough to raise eyebrows but just ambiguous enough to survive public scrutiny. Women wrote passionate letters to each other. Men took extended bachelor holidays together. Some even lived together for decades. Everyone else called it eccentric. They called it survival. Of course, there were exceptions. Oscar Wilde, yes, the Oscar Wilde, became the most infamous victim of the Labouchere Amendment. His affair with Lord Alfred Douglas led to a scandalous trial in 1895, where Wilde was convicted of gross indecency and sentenced to 2 years of hard labour. He emerged a broken man and died just a few years later, exiled and penniless. And if someone like Oscar freaking Wilde could fall, what chance did anyone else have? So let's bring this back to you. Let's say you're a young Victorian woman, and you've grown up with all the usual pressures: marry well, be quiet, be proper, don't show your ankles or your opinions. But one day, at a garden party, you meet her. She laughs too loudly. She has ink on her fingers. She quotes Byron like it's a threat. You fall, hard. It starts innocently enough. Walks in the garden. Late night talks in the parlour. Gloved hands brushing on the piano keys. You write her letters that are very dear and most fond, and you hide them in your sewing kit because that's the only safe place left. You start to think, maybe we could run away. Maybe we could live quietly. Maybe no one would know. But you know that's a lie. You know society will see you as dangerous, unnatural, a threat to everything it believes women should be. They'll say you're mad. They'll say you're sick. Your father will stop speaking to you. Your mother will pray harder. You'll lose friends, family, and all your carefully cultivated prospects. So you say nothing. You smile when she dances with a man. You pretend your heart isn't breaking. Because in Victorian England, queer love exists only in the margins. You hide it in poetry, in coded letters, in pressed flowers, in shared beds with too many pillows between you. You live your entire love story in parentheses, always with the knowledge that to be known is to be destroyed. But still, it happens. against every rule, every law, every whispered threat. People fall in love, people write their names on trees, people carve tiny revolutions into the fabric of everyday life. Some succeed, most don't. But all of them, every single one, reminds us that love has never been tame, and that even in the most repressed, tightly corseted corners of history, it always finds a way to bloom. So, you've made it through a whirlwind of misery. You've dodged chaperones, endured endless balls, escaped scandal, barely, or maybe even fell in love with someone society would absolutely not approve of. You're emotionally exhausted. You're possibly poor. You're probably whispering to yourself in a locked room at least once a week. And then it hits you. What if I just place an ad? Yes, in the newspaper, like a job listing, but for love. Welcome to the delightfully awkward, occasionally desperate and wildly underrated world of Victorian matrimonial ads, aka Victorian Tinder, minus the swiping and plus a lot more passive-aggressive references to moral character and land ownership. Let's set the mood. You're a lonely bachelor in his 30s. You've spent your 20s building a respectable business making umbrellas, or importing tea, or manufacturing very serious hats. You're now solvent, boring, and deeply single. Society hasn't handed you a wife on a doily, and your attempts at small talk at soirees have been, well, let's call them uninspired. So, you open the classified section and you write, "Gentleman of means and moderate habits seeks refined lady, aged 20 to 30, for companionship and eventual matrimony. Must be well-read, well-mannered, and in possession of sensible shoes." Boom. You're in the love game. On the other end, there might be a widowed schoolmistress with no dowry, and an increasingly awkward position in her cousin's spare room. She sees your ad. She writes back, carefully, politely, with just the right amount of punctuation to suggest modest interest but not desperation. And thus the wheels of fate begin to turn. Historical fact drop. By the mid-19th century, matrimonial advertisements were widely circulated in newspapers across Britain, particularly in urban centres like London, Manchester, and Liverpool. Entire sections were devoted to personal notices. Some papers even had dedicated matrimonial columns, often read with a mix of curiosity and thinly veiled judgment. At first, this was shocking, scandalous. Marriages were supposed to be arranged through family networks, not the back pages of the Illustrated London News. But as cities grew, families spread out, and more people found themselves living independently in boarding houses and apartments. Marriage by newspaper became more common, especially among the middle class. Of course, it was still risky. For one, there was no background check, no selfies, no social media stalking. You might exchange a few letters and then, if all went well, arrange a discreet public meeting in the company of a trusted third party, read your suspicious aunt with knitting needles and judgmental eyes. You might be exactly who you said you were. Or you might be a con man, a fortune hunter, a bored baron pretending to be a clergyman, or a woman in disguise collecting stories for a shocking novel. The anonymity was both exciting and dangerous. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Some enterprising Victorians ran fake matrimonial ad schemes, placing ads under false pretences, collecting letters, and sometimes money, then disappearing. In one case, a man in Birmingham reportedly advertised himself as 3 different bachelors across various papers, collecting dozens of letters from hopeful women before being caught. Victorian catfishing. No electricity required. Now, if you think these ads are all sad and hopeless, wrong. Some were wildly entertaining, like this real one. Bachelor 42, tall with fine whiskers and moderate habits, seeks lady not given to fainting or overuse of lace. Must enjoy walking and boiled meats. No actors. Or, widower with 2 lively children and an interest in moral science desires woman of strong constitution and good soup-making abilities. No romantics. Swipe left, Charlotte Bronte. And what about you? Let's say you're an unmarried lady, 27 years old, staying with your married sister, who keeps reminding you how lucky she is to have found Harold before her waist thickened. You're tired of parties, tired of smiling, tired of being a decorative afterthought in every social gathering, so you place an ad. You don't use your real name, of course. You're MC, age 27, fond of literature and moonlight. You ask for a gentleman with honest habits, a steady income, and a love of quiet conversation. You send it, and you wait. Days pass. Then one morning a letter arrives, handwritten, neat, careful. He's 35. He works in a bookshop. He has a limp from a childhood injury, but he enjoys the works of Wordsworth and thinks people should always say good morning to their neighbours, no matter the weather. You write back. One letter becomes 2, then 10, then a meeting. He's shy. His jacket doesn't quite fit, but his eyes are kind, and he listens like your words are made of something precious. And you think, maybe this is what love looks like when no one's watching. Not dances and diamonds, just two people trying to find each other in a world that tells them they're too old, too plain, too far behind. There were plenty of people who mocked matrimonial ads, who said they were pathetic, vulgar, dangerous, and sure, some were, but others turned into lifelong partnerships, formed not through balls or birthright, but mutual hope, quiet bravery, a willingness to say, I'm here, I'm trying, are you? So while the rest of the world was busy whispering about scandals and ankle sightings, a whole secret network of ordinary people were reaching for each other, through ink, paper, and maybe just a little bit of faith. Okay, so let's say you do survive the whole mess. You flirted through parlour games, aced the family approval gauntlet, brought a respectable dowry to the table, married within your class, or pretended convincingly enough, and managed to avoid scandal, arrest, elopement, or being shipped off to your cousin's rectory in Devon to recover from that little incident. You did it. You made it to the finish line. You're married. Congrats. Except, here's the final kick in the corset. Marriage doesn't end the nightmare. It just opens a new door, one that locks behind you. Because once you say, I do, in Victorian England, you're not just married. You're now, legally, his. Let's start with the big, suffocating legal reality. The doctrine of coverture. Historical fact alert. Under Victorian law, the moment a woman married, she ceased to exist as an individual legal entity. Her husband literally absorbed her. They became one person, and surprise, that person was him. You could no longer own property, sign contracts, sue, be sued, or have any legal standing apart from your husband. Your identity was legally vaporized the moment the clergyman said, you may kiss the bride. Your inheritance, his. Your wages, if you dare to earn any, his. Your body, also, legally, his. Yes, that's exactly as terrifying as it sounds. There was no concept of marital consent in the eyes of the law. A husband had the right to sexual access to his wife whenever he pleased. It wasn't considered possible for a husband to rape his wife, because the law didn't recognize you as separate people, so your no didn't legally exist. Romantic, right? But it gets worse. Let's say your husband turns out to be an absolute disaster. He drinks, gambles, cheats, or just generally makes life unbearable. You want out, you want space, you want a divorce. Well, tough luck. Because getting a divorce in Victorian England was about as easy as building a steam engine from scratch in your parlour. Nearly impossible. Absurdly expensive, and full of double standards so infuriating they'd make your lace collar burst into flames. For a man to divorce his wife, he just had to prove adultery. That's it. One accusation of infidelity, and boom, single man status reinstated. But for a woman, she had to prove adultery plus another aggravating factor: cruelty, incest, desertion, bestiality, don't ask. Or what they charmingly called unnatural offences. Because a cheating husband by itself was not a good enough reason for a woman to leave. After all, what if he just needed space? What if she had failed to inspire his affection? What if she'd been too emotional? You know, the usual villainy of having feelings. Oh, and let's say you do manage to escape, somehow against all odds. Congratulations again. The court will now most likely give your husband custody of your children. Because of course he gets the kids. You're an unstable woman who tried to break the sacred institution of a marriage. You're clearly unfit. So now you're divorced, broke, childless, and disgraced. which is great because all the gentlemen will definitely be lining up to date you now. Here's your quirky fringe fact for the evening. In 1857, the Matrimonial Causes Act made civil divorce possible in England. Before that, you literally had to get a private act of Parliament to end your marriage. As in, "Dear Lord Chamberlain, I'd like to cancel my husband, please. May I petition the entire British government?" The 1857 Act was progress, but only just. The rules still heavily favoured men and shamed women into staying quietly miserable. Let's talk daily life. Being a married woman in Victorian England meant playing the role of hostess, housekeeper, child-bearer, moral compass, nurse, and silent cheerleader. Your days were planned around his schedule, his meals, his guests, his moods. You had no legal right to your children. You had no legal right to your own money. And the worst part? Everyone told you this was success. You did what you were supposed to do. You married well. You fulfilled your womanly destiny. And now you get to sit quietly by the fire while your husband rants about tariffs and falls asleep with his brandy glass still half full. And here's the twist. Not all marriages were bad. Some were affectionate, companionate, even loving. But even in the best cases, the woman's autonomy was always a negotiation. You were only as free as your husband allowed you to be. And if he changed his mind, so did your rights. You might be thinking, didn't any woman fight back? Oh yes. There were women who refused to disappear, who used their influence, their intelligence, and their stubbornness to chip away at the system from within. Activists, writers, wives who pushed the boundaries of coverture and consent until the law had to pay attention. But they were the exception. Most women did what they were told, or didn't, and paid dearly. Back to you. You're sitting at your own dining table now, in your own respectable house. Your husband is reading the paper. Your children are being raised by a nursemaid you barely get to choose. You keep the books in order, the cook in check, and your voice in your throat where it belongs. You married him because you were supposed to. Because it was your best option. Because the alternative was spinsterhood, or scandal, or being shipped off to teach in a schoolroom until you withered into lace and silence. You didn't expect fireworks, but sometimes, late at night, when the fire dies down and your hair is unpinned, you remember what it felt like to run through a garden at midnight, or the way that one stranger smiled at you like you were the only person in the ballroom, or the letter you burned because it was too warm, too honest, too much. You love your family. You love your life, at least the parts of it you're allowed to own. But sometimes, just sometimes, you wonder, what would it have been like if marriage hadn't been the finish line? And yet, despite all of it, the curtsies and corsets, the calling cards and cruel whispers, the dowries, chaperones, unspoken rules, and marriages with the emotional warmth of a tax audit, some people still fell in love. Not just, we'll make this work, marriages. Not just strategic unions where affection was a happy bonus. No, we're talking about the real stuff. Passion, devotion, connection. The kind of love that makes someone cross counties, ruin reputations, or write poetry so embarrassing they bury it in the garden. So, yes. Tonight we end with a question. When love actually worked, what did that look like? Because for all the ways Victorian dating sucked, truly, gloriously sucked, there were always outliers. People who managed to find each other in spite of the rules, not because of them. Let's start with some examples. Real, messy, against-the-odds romances. Historical fact alert. Consider the love story of Elizabeth Barrett and Robert Browning. Elizabeth was an invalid, housebound, and heavily controlled by her possessive father. Robert was a poet with entirely too many feelings. They wrote each other letters, hundreds of them. Over time, their correspondence became emotional, then romantic, then revolutionary. Eventually, Elizabeth ran away with Robert to Italy. They married in secret. Her father never forgave her, but she called their life together the happiest of her existence. Then there's John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor, whose relationship started as a friendship, one that grew deeper over decades. They were both intellectual equals, a rarity, and when they finally married after her husband died, it wasn't for convenience or optics, it was for love. Their writing influenced each other, and Mill credited her with shaping much of his thinking on women's rights. Imagine that, a husband actually listening to his wife. Groundbreaking. There were also countless unsung couples living quietly in the margins, same-sex lovers exchanging coded letters, working-class pairs who married not for gain, but for companionship. Middle-class spouses who forged real partnerships within the rigid expectations of gender roles. Not perfect, not free, but real. These were the people who made love work in spite of everything. They played their part in public, modest, composed, proper. But behind closed doors they carved out tiny sanctuaries where affection could breathe, where secrets could be shared, where someone might tuck a note into a sewing kit, or pause just a beat longer at the garden gate. But here's the painful part, the open scholarly debate, if you will. Did love always have to be secret to survive in Victorian England? Some argue that genuine equal love was only possible outside the rigid expectations of marriage, that the legal and social framework simply didn't allow for intimacy and autonomy to coexist, that as long as one partner owned the other, legally, financially, even morally, love was always on a leash. Others say, love finds a way. That even within the constraints people made it work. That a kind husband and a thoughtful wife could grow toward each other, learn each other, become more than their circumstances. That companionship, if tended gently enough, could bloom into something beautiful, even under the weight of obligation. The answer? Maybe both. Maybe some love stories flourished behind locked doors, others withered under wedding vows. Some couples learned to fake it until it felt real. Others loved in full colour from the first letter. And then, some never got the chance. Back to you. Let's imagine you're older now. Your hair is streaked with silver. Your hands are steadier than your memory. You've lived through a lot. Marriage. Mourning. Maybe scandal. Maybe safety. You've played the part. Maybe you were lucky. Maybe you weren't. But there's still a box under your bed. In it, a pressed flower. A lock of hair, a crumpled letter that begins, "My dearest, I think of you even in my dreams." Maybe you married them, maybe you didn't, but for one moment in the midst of all the rules and rituals you felt something real. It sparked, it burned, it sang inside you like a secret no one else ever had the right to hear. That's what keeps you warm now, when the world feels too quiet. Not the ballrooms, not the lace, not the family trees or the proper table settings, just that one moment, that one look, that one name whispered like a prayer into your own heart. So yes, dating sucked in Victorian England. It was a logistical nightmare trapped inside a morality play, dressed in crepe and guarded by 1,000 unspoken rules. But love? Love still tried. It always does. And sometimes, miraculously, it won. Okay, you made it. That was a lot. You've just survived 30,000 words of corseted chaos, coded courtship, blacksmith weddings, whispered scandals, ghosted dance cards, emotionally repressed suitors, legal vaporization through marriage, and one very emotionally complicated teacup. So let's come back down to earth for a second. It's late now, probably. Unless you've been binging this while walking your dog or ignoring your emails, no judgment. Either way, take a deep breath. Let it out slowly. Unclench your jaw. Maybe stretch your neck. Maybe lie down if you aren't already. Because here's the thing. For all its frills and formality, the Victorian era wasn't that different from ours, not really. Underneath the lace and law books, people were still just people. Longing, pretending, trying, failing, falling, looking for that one person who saw them clearly, even if they couldn't say it out loud. And dating, still complicated, still full of risk, still capable of making you feel like a feral raccoon in a bonnet no matter what century you're in. But knowing the past, really knowing it, lets you see your own story differently. The absurdity, the beauty, the rules we break, the ones we still carry. And how love, however impossible it seems, always tries to sneak through the cracks. So tonight, whether you're single, partnered, or building a shrine to your ex in the cupboard under your stairs, I hope this little history of romantic misadventure made you feel seen, or at least amused. Now close your eyes. You don't need to worry about scandal tonight. Your ankles are safe, the chaperone has gone home, and whatever love looks like for you, it's still out there, maybe closer than you think. Good night.